Blog Talk Radio.
Everybody. I'm Tarhaka LB, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's broadcast on more stacking up the real truth. We're going to be dealing with the following questions. What is the truth as told by the legends themselves? What about Moorish women and children? Now, I don't know how a lot of people see it, because I posted an ad today of some of the greatest pioneers of what we would call African American descent, legends in their own right. And we have a few brothers coming in, well, they're not Moors. Okay. I mean, you mean to tell me that you are willing to throw away all of these groundbreaking achievements for you and me before we ever became a Moor or knew anything about being a Moor, because they didn't say they was a Moor. Hold on, man. I ain't gonna be able to go along with that. What we're going to do tonight, because, see, I've been running a series of podcasts here in an attempt to give us all of the background information on where we are, where we came from, and what the future looked like us as a people. And I'm using a whole lot of information. And tonight, we're going to come from this stuff from a legendary position. We're going to deal with it from a scientific position, a genetic position, a scholarly position. I mean, in every conceivable way that I could possibly do it. Now, you got people that have been quite prominent. Matter of fact, today, the legendary actor, James Earl Jones, they say that he passed away this morning. And I look at his achievements as far as being on the big screen and his fine acting career and all of this stuff. But I'm just simply not going to dismiss him and his achievements because, well, he didn't, you know, he ain't say nothing about the prophet, and he didn't, he ain't belong to the temple, and he didn't say Islam, and he didn't say nothing about being a Moor. And come on, give me a break. But nevertheless, the truth as told by the legendary heavyweights, we're going to get on them later on this evening. But I want to deal with this from a genetic perspective. Okay, I want to look at this from a genetic perspective first. And I'm going to bring in a true heavyweight in his own right. I mean, everybody, when this brother speaks, everybody listens. And so I'm going to bring him in first, okay? And then we're going to be dealing with a lot of tribes and peoples that the United States simply tried to cover up and hide. I'm also going to deal with the damaging effects on our women through stereotypes. We're going to deal with that tonight as well. But before we get started, I'm going to go into a short commercial break, and when we come back, we going in. Okay?
Hey, everybody. Remember, October the 26th, 2024, in Jacksonville, Florida, the Black Vegan Fest, live entertainment, fun for the whole family, including children. Chefs will be cooking up a storm, and they professionals. Education on how to grow your own food. The children going to learn too. Whatever you do, be here. Don't miss this one. Peace.
Let me make sure I got this right. You have a mortgage. You were told the bank would give you a loan for your home. But when you got to the bank, they didn't give you anything or sign anything. But presto changeo, you have a new mortgage. Then you find out your mortgage has been sold to another company you don't know and don't have any contract with. It seems to me something is wrong. When you walked out the bank, you had some papers in your hand, but no check. Let's get to the bottom, down to the bottom of this kind of stuff. Go to TarhakaDeadElimination.org. That's TarhakaDeadElimination.org. Let's bring the fraud to a close. How about that? This kind of stuff is going on all over the United States, but most people don't even understand what to do about it. TarhakaDeadElimination.org.
Neil deGrasse Tyson is a very popular astrophysicist. He's also an author who tries to communicate science to the general public. I thought his take on African people was interesting and worthy of discussion. To paraphrase, in his interview with Joe Rogan, he was essentially saying that every human attribute on the spectrum from the greatest to the least you will find in Africa because of its genetic diversity. Today, I wanted to explore how this perspective parallels with African history. What up, African world? It's Home Samir, and welcome back to another video of African history, culture, and worldview. By supporting this channel on Patreon, you're helping in the creation of these videos and contributing to this content. The link to Patreon is in the description box below. Also, stay tuned with a word from my sponsors.
Have you ever wanted to learn an African language? If so, keep watching. There are many ways to connect to different African cultures. Many do it through the enjoyment of the music, the dancing, and my personal favorite, the food. But when it comes to learning the languages, that can be a bit challenging. So, here we are. We here at Speak Afrique are trying to lay the groundwork to build that bridge with our new short phrases and vocabulary series. These are the seed projects to something much larger that we're building. We currently have languages such as Twi, Kikongo, Mandinka, Igbo, and many more will be added as time goes on. So, if you want to start your journey to connecting to Mama Africa, head over to Speak Afrique at iTunes or Amazon and let's start learning together. Ngiyabonga. Salamigashe.
To begin, this video is designed to draw parallels between Neil deGrasse Tyson's sagacious take on African people and the historical events within Africa. So ultimately, this video is theory-based. However, keep in mind that I will be drawing from factual information. In his interview with Joe Rogan, Neil deGrasse Tyson advanced a very interesting perspective on African people. At the core, he was saying that because humans originated in Africa, Africans have the greatest genetic diversity. Because of this wide spectrum, we should expect to find the tallest and shortest people in the world in Africa, and the fastest and slowest people in the world in Africa. His most salient point is where I would like the focus of this video to be. He said that we should also expect to find the smartest person in the world in Africa, and the least intelligent person in the world also in Africa. He demonstrated his points and defended his position quite well. One point that stood out to me was when he suggested that we know the fastest person in the world because we're actively looking for them, and that they're quite often African or of African descent. However, we don't know the slowest person in the world because we're not actually looking for them. That also remains true for the least intelligent person in the world. Nobody is really looking for them. He continued this line of thinking and applied it historically to European anthropologists. Because of their prejudice, European anthropologists, missionaries, historians, and others were not looking for the smartest person in the world in Africa. What they were looking for were justifications and angles to colonize more effectively. Here is the parallel I see. Early European visitors were also not looking for civilization on par or greater than their own in Africa. European philosophers since the 18th century like Immanuel Kant and David Hume colored African people as naturally inferior, and so there was no civilization to discover. Hume and Kant held the view that Africans, in virtue of their blackness, are precluded from the realm of reason and civilization. Their views were not some isolated incident. This was the popular mythology of the time. Interestingly enough, when European observers did encounter African civilization, they created more mythology to explain it away. But we'll get into that later. So what are the parallels between Neil's genetic diversity theory and African history? If his perspective on African intelligence has any validity, we should expect to see some very impressive reflections of African intellect that wasn't occurring anywhere else during the same period. And I think that's something that can be illustrated. One of the most impressive things about Africa is that most African people completely skipped the Bronze Age and went straight into iron. The traditional developmental pattern around the world was the Stone Age, Bronze Age, and then the Iron Age. But most Africans, for whatever reason, completely skipped the Bronze Age. Now, of course, this in and of itself is not an indication of being on the extreme positive end of the intellectual spectrum. However, Combined with other aspects, it becomes very impressive. According to scholars Etienne Zangato and Augustine Hall, iron technology started in the Central African Republic. At Oboe, all the steps in the smelting and forging of iron, all of what archaeologists call the chaîne opératoire, are represented in materials from the excavated workshop, furnace structures, tourees, iron bits, slag, and stone anvils for hammering the iron, along with large quantities of datable charcoal. These sites of around 4,000 years ago represent the earliest ironworking yet known, not just in Africa, but anywhere in the world. They are not just too early in time, but separated by far too great a geographical distance to allow for any possible outside of Africa source for the technology. Moreover, iron smelting in Africa was accompanied with another first according to scholar Christopher Ehret. Yet there is still another remarkable African first in iron technology that we must take into account. African iron smelters living in the African Great Lakes region began to construct furnaces capable of generating sufficiently high temperatures to produce carbon steel directly from the smelt. And this is no small matter. Europeans did not learn to produce steel by a single step until the invention 2,000 years later in the 19th century. The Chinese were also ahead of the West in this respect. They had developed capacities for directly producing steel by the 11th century CE. But even their advance took place centuries after African smelters already had attained this capability. I think most people would agree that iron technology was a very important development in human history, and the fact that Africans were the first humans to do this aligns with Neil deGrasse's point. Due to their ossified stance concerning African inferiority, European observers found themselves in intellectually compromising positions when encountering African civilization. We see this cognitive dissonance with their discovery of Great Zimbabwe and the Yoruba sculptures of Ele-Ife. Historians, anthropologists, missionaries, and others simply could not abandon old models. The Africa that is portrayed in books by Western ethnologists and historians is the Africa of the savage Africans who did nothing, developed nothing, or created nothing historical. Despite this popular narrative, European observers did not think in monolithic fashion. There were some who were honest about what they saw and gave credit to the African progenitors. They were aware that the premise did not always match observation. Many people today, scholar and layman alike, polemically approach an indigenous African origin of Egyptian civilization. A proliferated acceptance of it would make Neil deGrasse's argument seemingly unassailable. Egyptian civilization is considered by some to be the greatest in human history. One European philosopher and abolitionist of the 18th century seemed convinced about the origin of Egyptian civilization, not only claiming it to be the product of black intellect, but espousing the idea that Africans were the first learned men in human history. Ostensibly, the words of Constantine de Volnay serve as a parallel to Neil deGrasse Tyson's point. Here's what he had to say. We have the strongest reasons to believe that the country neighboring to the tropic was the cradle of the sciences, and, of consequence, that the first learned nation was a nation of blacks. For it is incontrovertible that by the term Ethiopians the ancients meant to represent a people of black complexion, thick lips, and woolly hair. I am therefore inclined to believe that the inhabitants of Lower Egypt were originally a foreign colony imported from Syria and Arabia, a medley of different tribes of savages, originally shepherds and fishermen, who by degrees formed themselves into a nation, and who by nature and descent were enemies of the Thebans, by whom they were no doubt despised and treated as barbarians. I have suggested the same ideas in my Travels into Syria, founded upon the black complexion of the Sphinx. I have since ascertained that the antique images of Thebes have the same characteristic. Now, this is not an appeal to an 18th century European authority, but it goes to show that some saw the stark contradictions in the disparaging narrative and presented a countervailing belief that Africa is actually the cradle of the sciences, a belief that strongly parallels points made by Neil deGrasse Tyson. So what do you guys think? Does the historical evidence support Neil deGrasse's theory? In other words, does African history reflect both extreme ends of the human spectrum? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you like these videos and want to help in its continued production, consider supporting the home team on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a very popular
Okay, there you have it. But now, let's take a look and see exactly what it was that Mr. deGrasse actually said to prompt an analysis on what he said. Okay, so let's take a look at it and see what it was that Neil deGrasse Tyson. Now y'all know who he is. The brother that deal with the space and sharp brother. Y'all know who he is. But anyway, let's take a look right now.
Because the anthropologists were not thinking genetic diversity, they're thinking skin color. They put them all in one bin. But if you have the most genetic diversity, then in practically every way humans vary, you would find the extreme of that in the African continent. Where would you find the tallest people in the world? Watusi tribe of Africa. How about the shortest people in the world?
Pygmies.
The Pygmies. Not even that far away.
Right.
Geographically. They have the same skin color, so the Europeans said these are one group of people, one race. Where might you find the slowest people in the world? Well, no one looks for them. Where would you find, there's no races to find the slowest people. How about the fastest people? Africa. Okay? People of African descent have dominated the long distance as well as the sprint, two completely different physical abilities. Oh, but they're all dark-skinned people, they're all Negroes. Okay? Where would you likely find the dumbest person in the world? Africa. How about the smartest person in the world? Africa.
How about the Egyptians?
The
From
Europeans
Africa.
did not look for people smarter than they were. Okay? And to this day, where they find evidence where that might have been the case, you have people saying aliens did it. Egypt is, of course, in Africa.
Yeah.
A brilliant civilization. Oh my gosh. While Europeans were still either disemboweling heretics or whatever the hell they were doing, it was even before that, thousands of years ago. So my point is, if you don't look for it and you don't find it and you're going to create a map of humans of the world, you're going to put yourself at the top. That's what you're going to do. And you're going to write things like this. Who do you want to hear from? Thomas Jefferson or Francis Galton?
Jefferson.
Jefferson, 1785. Speaking of the Negroes, comparing them by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory, they are equal to the whites. In reason, much inferior, as I think one could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid. And in imagination, they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous.
What is Euclid?
I honestly don't know how many Euclid-fluent white people Jefferson knew in the original American colonies. Euclid invented geometry. Okay, Euclidean geometry is ancient Greece. And his books still exist to this day. So he's saying the black slaves don't know Euclid, can't figure out Euclid.
Well, they haven't been educated.
But regardless,
The whole
how
thing is
many
so
how many
ridiculous.
white farmers in 1785 USA
Also.
knew Euclid?
Yeah,
No.
zero.
Okay. Okay. But whatever were his observations and objections to black people, he had no hesitation continually mating with at least one of them, producing 6 children. So you know what I did here? Then there's a guy who wrote a whole book comparing black people and white people, a book that was used into the 1960s. It was called The Origin of Races by Carlton Kuhn. He wrote, if Africa was the cradle of mankind, which he recognizes, it was only an indifferent kindergarten. Europe and Asia were our principal schools. So these are people putting themselves at the top. He's white, so he's got to put white people at the top. Then I thought, suppose anthropologists were black racists instead of white racists. What would they write? What would they come up with?
Well, also what he's saying is ridiculous because if it's kindergarten, how did they do the pyramids? It's the most complex structures ever known to man.
Hold on.
So we can't reproduce today. All of us
My only point is, when you have that mindset and you have to put yourself at the top, and all people with dark skin are one entity, you're not looking for people smarter than you. You're not. There's other evidence here. Do you realize that the people who get the highest scores on standardized tests in England are people, immigrants from the Igbo tribe in Nigeria? And their kids outscore all the quote native white people in the town. If you're not looking for them, you're not finding them. It just doesn't. It's a thing. It's all here in this chapter, and all I'm doing is bringing science to it. That's all I'm.
Okay, there you have it. What do you think about that? Well, what we're gonna do here tonight is tonight we're gonna bring out the heavyweights and a true legend in his own right, just one of quite a few, to hear what he has to say about who's who was first, who was second, where you came from, what you invented, what you brought to the table. He gonna lay it all out in a debate with some authors and supposed to be professors. And in my opinion, it's just my personal opinion, this was the one of the worst whoopings that I've seen. But I'm going to let you judge for yourself. I'm going to go to another commercial break, and when we come back, because I can't wait. I was going to try to save this here for last, but I can't wait. I'm just sorry. I can't wait. We're going to take a little quick break, and then we coming in. We finna straighten this out.
Let me make sure I got this one right also. Someone tells you that you must pay them money about your children in the form of child support. They also say they would suspend your driver's license. And they said they would garnish your wages. Who were they talking to? A debtor? Or did they make the mistake and say it to a creditor? When you got married, they said it was a part of that also. Request my free report at tarhakadebtelimination.org. That's tarhakadebtelimination.org. Let's have some fun. Fill out the contact us form for my free report, and I'll rush it straight to your email box. What about this banking stuff? What's going on in the United States? I tell you what, request my free report at tarhakadebtelimination.org. Peace.
is my foot. This foot.
I came to this subject before I was 10 as a Baptist Sunday school teacher. I wanted to teach junior class in Sunday school, so I learned to read very early. What baffled me from the beginning was the Bible itself. I could not find my people in a book that's supposed to be about all mankind. And what called my attention to the neglect of Africa was the Sunday school lessons with all those white angels. And when they said God is love, God is kind, God is no respect of kin, I kept wondering, why didn't he let at least one or two little brown or black angels sneak into heaven? So I began to suggest that somebody else had tampered with God's book in favor of somebody else, and that the Bible to a great extent was a rationale for European domination, but had been used as such. Then, coming to, after leaving Georgia, after a white man that I've worked for, if he's alive today, he's a liberal with a capital L. His name was Gagsteiner. I asked him about some books on the African people in ancient history. And in the language of the South, he let me down slow. I mean, he spoke kindly. He said, John, I'm sorry that you came from a race that's made no history. But if you persevere, if you obey laws and study hard, you make history someday, and you personally might one day be a great Negro like Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was the one thing whites approved of at that time. All right, while doing chores at a local high school, holding the coat and the books of a recitalist, I opened a book called The New Negro, and I found an essay by a Puerto Rican of African descent, Arthur Schomburg. The essay was called The Negro Digs Up His Past. Now I knew I was not only older than slavery, I was older than my oppressor, and my oppressor was the last branch of the human race to enter that arena. Mock civilization. Don't get mad, get smart, prove me wrong. Now, in the old Harlem History Club, under Willis and Huggins, long since dead, John Jackson, who died only a few years ago, and we had to take up a collection to bury him, Charles Seifert, J. Rogers, under all of these teachers pointing me to good material, and Arthur Schomburg telling me, go study the history of your masters. Study the people who took you out of history. Then you'll understand your history. I started on an old chestnut, recently mentioned, H.G. Wells' Outline of History. It is still worth reading. It is a good basic outline. His basic facts are in order. When he tells you about the Crusades, he's not off one iota. But his interpretation is basically Eurocentric to the point of being a prejudiced document. Now, I was reading these kinds of books. I was reading Spingarn's Decline of the West when I was 18 years old. So I began to read European masterpieces, and I began to read European curiosity about Africa. Gerald Massey's 6th volume, Egypt, Light of the World, 2 volumes. Natural Genesis, 2 volumes. Book of the Beginning, 2 volumes. And I began to read Gerald Massey's attitude on religion and his idea that nearly European concepts of religion were stolen from outside of Europe. He was not a historian. He was not an Egyptologist. He was an agnostic, fighting the arrogance of the European of that day. See, the History Club led me to not only reading masterpieces by white radical writers who set the black radical writers in motion. A whole lot of claims blacks did not make until they saw the documents in works written by Europeans. And these works written by Europeans, what black had the time and the money to sit down and do a 6-volume work?
You get to ask Professor Clark a question.
Yeah. I hardly know where to begin. One thing I'm curious about, I had a quick look actually at the introduction to the second edition of Bradley's The Iceman Inheritance, a very interesting book with a lot of interesting hypotheses about the origins of cultures and civilizations. Professor Clark wrote an introduction to the second edition to it in which he stated that the first show of European literary intelligence surfaced around 1250 BCE with the publication of 2 books of folklore, the Odyssey and the Iliad. And that struck me as somewhat curious because, in fact, as far as most scholars seem to be able to tell, the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed actually orally and didn't reach a literary form, if you mean by that a written form, until probably the 6th century BCE in Athens. There are obviously texts from Mycenae and Crete and elsewhere with real Greek in a literary form from before 1250, in fact going back probably to 1600 or so. But this has significant implications for the idea which some scholars have put forth that Egyptian language was deeply influential on the first form of Greek that we have, that is the Linear B tablets.
So I'm awaiting the question.
That is my question. Professor Clark has stated that this is the first form of literary intelligence that surfaced around 1250, and in fact it did not, and I'm curious how he is maintaining that.
All right.
It is the first book, and it's a book of folklore, and we really don't know whether Homer wrote it or whether Homer was man or woman. It's the first book to become known basic to the West in a form that we could study and conjecture about, and it emerged at the time Europe was beginning to show some intellectual maturity. And if you deal with this, you have to deal with what Professor Lester accused me of, not paying attention to historical chronology. And if she read any of my texts, any of my numerous guides and curriculars and lecture notes, you know that I'm a specialist on chronology. I know that 1 comes first and 2 comes second. But what I was trying to get across is that in the 8th century to the 12th century, so the intellectual emergence of Europe, at a time Egypt was in its 23rd dynasty and dying after nearly 10,000 years of some forms of organized society. Europe intellectually was just being born. And I further maintain that Europe in general had nothing to do with the creation of Rome and Greece, and yet the challenge of Rome and Greece created Europe. because they were scattered tribes, and the challenge of Rome and Greece brought them together, and they became a people strong enough to create a state. If anybody got any information to the contrary, state the information to the contrary. I maintain that there was no Europe. You're giving Europe credit for things that happened before the first European war. Shoe or lived in a house that had a window. And I'm saying that you have not read, not just Massey, Joe Massey, and his European disciple, Churchward, Signs and Symbols of Primordial Man, the Origins of Religion, and his extensive work on Freemasonry. You've not read the American disciple of Massey, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, is Who is This King of Glory, one of the best written books on the Christ story, where he proves that the basis of European spirituality was taken directly from Africa.
Professor Rogers, would you like to follow on your question?
I mean,
no one is actually maintaining that literary Greek culture pre-existed any number of Near Eastern cultures. Again, I find it a bit curious.
I don't accept Egypt as Near East. I accept Egypt as physically part of Africa, created by the Africans from the south.
Even if I concede or admit or agree with you that Egypt is part of Africa, what I'm about to say
There will be order. Thank you. There will be order. Thank you very much.
Do I detect some disagreement?
Yeah.
My point was going to be that the most recent scholarship about the genesis of those two oral epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, points in fact in another direction to influence, and that is in fact the Hittite Empire, whose documents we can read very easily, and there may well be independent confirmation of the historicity of some form of a Trojan War in those documents. And so what I'm really asking is, why is it that we're just really looking in one direction when we're talking about the origins of Greek civilization?
Professor Clark?
When Alexander entered Egypt, he wrote home to his mother and said that he at last reached the land where the Greek gods began, Apollo and Zeus. And he wanted to consult one of the great African teachers of oracles. And the oracle asked, how old is this man? He said, 32. They said, in 20 years, maybe he'll be wise enough to ask me a question that I care to answer.
Professor Clark, would you like to ask Professor Rogers a question? All right, we are waiting. Professor Clark?
Yes.
It is your turn to ask Professor Rogers a question.
My main concern is that they seem to have equated the civilizations of the Tigris and the Euphrates with the civilization of the Nile. What proof do you have that the civilization of the Tigris and the Euphrates predated the civilization of the Nile?
I don't think that I said that, and I don't think that anyone maintains that. I think the Hittite Empire obviously comes at a much later period.
I know very clear when the Hittite Empire came, I know what damage they did, because I maintain that every people who came into Africa, Greeks, everything from modern day English, everybody that came into Africa did Africa more harm than good. And that Africa owes nothing to outsiders in regard to development, because all of them declared war on African culture, war on African civilization, war on African ways of life. They began to bastardize Africa and confuse and create a kind of historical schizophrenia that the Africans had even got rid of to this very day. And they created whole words that did not previously exist, like Middle East. Middle from what?
In round two, we will continue. Professor Clark, you will ask the first question in round two of Professor Mary Lefkowitz.
Well, Professor Lefkowitz, at your own admission, you encountered J.A. Rogers 4 or 5 years ago. J.A. Rogers didn't say he was a historian. He was a searcher trying to find the role of the African personality in world history. He worked over 50 years of his life, gave his service, died broke. What gives you the audacity to think that you can dismiss Rogers out of hand, and what gave you the maturity to think that you can judge a writer like Sheikh Anta Diop, the finest historical writer we have produced in the 20th century?
Sir, what do you deal with that?
I try to ask questions of all the material I read. I try to answer those questions on the basis of the evidence, the historical evidence. It all, in my view, comes down to that. And I do not wish to criticize any individual at all. I am dealing only with written work. The people who write that, I do not always know, and I have no individual or personal criticism of them. This is the way scholars, I'm sure, as you know, proceed, and that is simply what I did in my book. I will leave it to everyone who reads the book to judge what I did.
All right. I think you have emphasized too much the word black, and we made the same mistake. Black tells you how you look, but it don't tell you who you are. The proper name of a people must always relate to land, history, and culture. I did not say Cleopatra was black. I quoted someone else who inferred that. My defense of Cleopatra is not on her blackness, but on no matter whatever she was born in Africa. Her manipulation of Mark Antony and Caesar kept the worst aspect of Roman rule from the backs of Africa. I defend her as an African nationalist. And that's a good defense. And no matter what she did with her wares in and out of bed, there's a whole lot of people got less for it.
Professor Lefkowitz, you may ask a question of Professor Clark.
Professor Clark, do you think that we should always judge history in terms of race?
Look, there was no such thing as race in the psyche of the world until the Europeans put it into the psyche of the world. The Africans knew nothing about race and didn't think they belonged to anything called a race. And when the Africans saw the Europeans, because they have a traditional hospitality to strangers, They didn't fight them. They didn't kill. They were curious about them. And with the African explorers, especially Mungo Park, went into Africa, nobody hurt him. Nobody shot at him. Nobody shot any arrows at him. The Europeans went in peacefully, but the Africans heard that Mungo Park was a pork eater. Most people don't know it, but Africans were not great pork eaters, and they're not great pork eaters today. Pork was a meat you ate in certain ceremonies, certain times a year. But we were not great pork eaters before we came to the United States or were forced to the United States. But in the United States, we had to eat the part of the pigs that white folks threw away, so we made delicacies out of it and survived. I had this argument with Malcolm X. I said, if it wasn't for the black woman making delicacies out of pig feet, pig heels, guts, chitlins, you and I wouldn't be here arguing the point. I'm afraid that you're not only a delinquent in African history, you're delinquent in African folklore. So much of our history is tied up with our folklore, but Europe introduced words that didn't exist in anyone's vocabulary before. No one ever thought of anybody being inferior or superior. Intelligent people don't even a human being can't fall into that category. And nobody had the extensive problems the Europeans had with women, because in the period of feudalism in Europe that lasted over 1,000 years, the white woman in Europe was a vassal. But the African woman has never been a vassal in that sense. If we check out the culture unity of black Africa, dealing with the history of the matriarch, I mean, he got all evidence right there that we were the first people to support a woman as head of state. We were the first people to support a woman as riding ahead of her army. We were the first people to make women a god.
But I wanted to follow up on a phrase that you said, and I didn't want to leave it unaddressed, the issue of full disclosure. And it is to that I'd like to ask the question of Professor Lefkowitz. Are you comfortable with the fact, you obviously were comfortable with the fact that your book, Not Out of Africa, subtitled How Afrocentrism Became an Excuse to Teach Myth as History, was underwritten by several foundations that have reportedly rightist leanings. I wondered whether this was a reflection of your own personal or ideological view, or whether you were just so cash-strapped that you took money from anyone.
No one tells me what to think, and no one tells me what to say except me, and the main financing of this book was out of my own pocket.
But surely you can appreciate the color of accepting funds from foundations that do not enjoy wide acclaim and receptivity. And I thought that maybe there was some concern on your part, in as much as you were interested in integrity, scholastic integrity and all, that you might have foregone the grants in the interest of academic and scholarly integrity.
If they had asked of me to do anything, I would not have accepted these grants. They did not do that. Therefore, the grants did not go to me. They went to Wellesley College, which had no objection to taking the money.
But still, the question remains. You have a duty, do you not, inasmuch as you are preparing work, the aim of which is to overturn the revisionism, you say, that is going on in black studies, particularly in African studies, this whole battle that you have been dealing with in terms of Afrocentricity. Do you not, regardless of where Wellesley chose to accept money from, do you not, as a scholar, have an obligation to discern where this money is coming from, to see whether the source is compatible with your own views as a scholar?
I did not see anything in the conditions of the grant that inhibited what I did and what I meant to do or say or think. I believe that I acted with perfect integrity. Now, you may disagree with that, and you may disagree with the aims of those foundations and other foundations, and that is what we do in a free country. Until they are outlawed, I don't see what else can be done.
Well, let me ask you the question perhaps more directly. Had there been, say, a foundation to wipe out scholarship of any sort, if such a foundation were to have given money to Wellesley College, would you have found it equally acceptable to take money from such a foundation to further your work?
I don't know what foundation you're talking about. This seems to be a totally
was a hypothetical question.
It's totally hypothetical. I don't know what you're trying to force me to say or to compel me into what corner you're tending to put me. If you want to go ahead and attack me, do.
I'm not
That's
forcing
fine.
you to say anything, Professor Lefkowitz. I'm just trying to elicit a cogent response from you.
Well, you be the judge of my response.
All right. Okay, in this last round, before we get to questions, and we will get to questions, but let me warn you, you ought to have questions that are questions, not lectures, and that are straight to the point. In this round, it will be a free-for-all in which all of the discussants are permitted to ask questions of each other and to chime in responses whether they are asked the question directly or not.
Will we have time to sum up?
Yes, you certainly will.
You treat. I think we should. All right. I just wanted Professor Lefkowitz to know some basic information about the concept of Afrocentricity. There's a lot of people who believe in the African awakening and discovering of their history and their culture who do not accept the word Afrocentricity because it's a compromise with the word African. It's either African centricity or it's nothing. That's right. And if she attacked Afrocentricity as a teacher of myth, have she attacked the nonsense about Columbus discovering America? Because he discovered absolutely nothing, and he committed an act of genocide. He set in motion an act of genocide 10 times worse than the act of genocide in Europe called the Holocaust, as though that was the only Holocaust in the world. That event in Europe was wrong. And even if only 6 people were killed, it was wrong. But it was a matter started in Europe by Europeans that should have been solved in Europe by Europeans.
I'm sure that you're aware, as we are, that there is a spectrum of Afro and African-centric views. I'm a little bit curious what you think then of the work of Asante, who, as far as I know, does call himself an Afrocentrist. Are you saying that Professor Asante's work actually is flawed conceptually?
I'm saying that all work under the guise of Afrocentrist is not perfect, but it is an earnest effort to restore Africa to a proper commentary in human history. I think Professor Sanchez's work is written too fast, and there's some things he hasn't checked out as well as he needs to, and I think too many times Afrocentricity becomes a personality cult, but that don't mean that I'm against African people discovering their history, their literature, their place in the political science of the world. That don't mean that I have not played a role in encouraging people to write about Africans in all the societies of the world. See, your talk keeps telling me what you have not read. You could not have been asking these questions about Afrocentricity if you have not read Anacalypsis, 2 volumes dealing with the massive explosion of African people throughout the whole world. You could not possibly have read with any degree of understanding the 3 volumes, Africans in early Asia, Africans in early Europe, Africans in early America. We're not talking about no hearsay. We're talking about documents. Professor Joseph Harris's book dealing with the global dimensions of the African diaspora. I don't know, I mean, you keep telling me, you keep confessing your ignorance with your questions. You have not read, I'm telling you, before Afrocentricity, radical Europeans had pioneered in this work. Now, I haven't even mentioned the radical black writers that you probably have not read. Now, if you read Chancellor Williams' chapter 2 in the book, Destruction of Black Civilization, read that chapter 2 called Egypt, Ethiopia's oldest daughter. And it deals with the southern African origins of Egypt. If you read a book called Nubia, Corridor to Africa, once more you got this. Also you got the early Arab slave trade. I keep saying nobody came into Africa to do African people any good. After the Romans had disgraced themselves trying to be early Christians, the Africans thought that by accepting Islam, they could get the Romans off of their back. They were right. They did get the Romans off their back. But the Arabs replaced the Romans on their back, and the Arabs are still on their back.
You've conducted, how long have you been, I hate to say this, but how long have you been in this storm? 5 years?
Sorry.
In this area of study?
I think I mentioned at the beginning that my undergraduate training was specifically in Near Eastern ancient history, so that's about 20 years ago at this point.
My undergraduate training is in economics, but I will not exactly say that I would go up against a real economist. It still is a BA degree, after all.
Well, my PhD is actually in classics and ancient history, and I'm curious, now that we're raising the question of qualifications, and you're asking me about judging those texts, whether in fact you do read Greek.
Yes.
Then,
but I'm not at issue here tonight. I'm not at issue.
Then perhaps you would like to tell me that when Herodotus uses the term melanchroes to describe Egyptians, what he means.
I go back to my answer. I'm not here proclaiming to be an expert on Herodotus or any of the so-called Greek philosophers.
But that's a Greek question.
No, it's not a Greek question at all. It is a question that you ask an expert, and I am not here claiming to be an expert. I also, in case you would like to know, have a distinction in Latin, and I speak German and French and Spanish, and a distinction in English as well. So I'm somewhat literate. I'm concerned, though, that so far I've been hearing bits and pieces of the discussion in specificity. You take fact A and you argue fact A, and you get a response based on fact A. I'm not so sure, though, that you have accomplished the major objective here tonight, which is to argue that bodies of work have no legitimacy. I would like you, in concluding, to at least get to that issue, that entire bodies of work have no legitimacy.
Are we getting to conclusions now?
Yes.
I don't know what's going on.
All right, the order would be as follows. We will start with Dr. Rogers, and then we will go to Dr. Lefkowitz, to Dr. Bernal, to Dr. Clark.
I'm baffled by that introduction about bodies of work. I don't think that that has anything to do with anything that either Professor Lefkowitz or I have said. But since you've asked me to conclude something about what we are trying to persuade people of, what I would say is this, that professors...
Excuse me, hold on please. I just don't want you to conclude about something that was not asked. So I would like to document it from the book. You claim, for example, and I'm reading from the cover, the back cover, the contributors to this volume argue that Bernal's claims are exaggerated and in many cases unjustified. You say also in the work, Bernal proposed a radical reinterpretation of the roots of classical civilization, contending that ancient Greek culture derived from Egypt and Phoenicia, and that European scholars have been biased against the notion of Egyptian and Phoenician influence on Western civilization. Since this is a 20-member compendium, I think it suggests that they're attacking a body of work.
I hope that in reading the back jacket cover and our description of Professor Bernal's enterprise, that we've been fair to him insofar as what he takes his project to be about. As far as I understand it, I think it is fair. My conclusion about that has to be framed in terms of what the object of that body of work is about. Professor Bernal says that his object, the cultural purpose, political purpose of Black Athena is to lessen European cultural arrogance. My question is, does it lessen European cultural arrogance to argue that early Greek culture was derived from Egypt and or Phoenicia? If we start out from the premise that we study Egypt or Phoenicia for what they contributed to early Greek culture, my opinion is that we are undervaluing Egypt and Phoenicia. And therefore, the project itself is, in the end, essentially Eurocentric and is its own refutation.
I think one can agree with the project of lessening European cultural arrogance completely, and that we applaud all efforts to do so. What we are concerned with is trying to establish what historical evidence shows the influence of what on what. And this is not a project which any of us here can complete at all. That many people must be involved in this, and it requires the thought and efforts of a lot of us to do it. We would like to think that it can be redone without rewriting history altogether, or without claiming that there has been a huge European cover-up of information. There is certainly true. You can claim that, but please remember, you must also show that it has been done. There are many things that Europe has been guilty of and responsible for, and certainly the covering, not the covering up, I don't mean to say that, but the absolute refusal to acknowledge the history of Africa, which I made reference to in my opening remarks, is something that we must continuously work on redressing. much more must be learned, much more must be studied. I am very much in favor of that, and I believe that it can start also in our teaching of American history, where in many cases the whole history of the African American contribution to American history has been ignored and neglected, and there are brilliant writers out there whose works are not being read. I think we should change all that. But we do not have to rewrite ancient history completely in order to do some of these important things. I would just simply ask, let us investigate carefully the degree of Egyptian influence on ancient Greece, but we must also investigate the Near Eastern cultures such as Phoenicia and the Hittites. After all, Phoenicia gave ancient Greece her alphabet. They didn't learn the alphabet from the Egyptians. It was too hard. It was easier to get it from the Phoenicians. And we must begin to work on those lines. I would like to see everyone work also on a period we haven't discussed much here tonight, where we really do see Egyptian influence on Greek culture, and that is in the Hellenistic period after Alexander got there and Greeks were living in Egypt. A huge number of Greeks were living in Egypt. There I think you can see some real influence.
This is now the third debate that we have had, and I'm very struck by what I see as a discrepancy between Mary Lefkowitz's speech and her writing. That in speech she is all sweetness and light and for open debate and openness in culture. Her writing is very different. The title, Not Out of Africa, is extremely provocative, and it reads, the text carries on in the same way. And I'd like to quote to you a letter I received from probably the most distinguished active classicist in the world today, who actually agrees with her on the academic side. Nevertheless, he writes, "I do not find her exposition cool, detached, and reasonable, despite her efforts to make it seem like that. It is, in fact, as I wrote in my review, an impassioned polemic. Of course, Mary wants to look scholarly and detached, but hers is the scholarship of the National Association of Scholars, which is funded by the same people that funded Not Out of Africa, and that leads us back to where Professor Clark began on the general political context in which this book has appeared."
I will defend Professor Lefkowitz's innocence because she is a pawn in somebody else's game. As I said in the beginning, it is beyond the lack and dislike of Afrocentricity, which has not even developed enough to be called a discipline. It is a world war to prepare the mind to accept the re-enslavement of Africa, to remove from the mind of all people anything good that the African has done, and to ignore the fact that Europe set up Africa to fall apart by imposing on Africa, to miseducated Africans, a nation state. The nation state is un-African. The African thrives at his best in the territorial state. Many cultures, many languages, side by side, challenging each other, fertilizing each other. What you might call an empire. If you study the last 1,000 years before slavery, the development of independent states in the Western Sudan, Ghana, Mali, Sangay, destroyed by the invasion from North Africa by the Arabs attacking the North African Muslims attacking the African Muslims and destroying the great University of St. Khoury and exiling its greatest scholar, Ahmed Baba, who admonished his students, believe in God and science. The Africans never separated God from science. The priest was scientist. The priest was the most knowledgeable person. That's why you had the concept of a priest God. Now, if they wipe this out of the mind of our children, and our children look at television and sound bites and think they were nothing but a nothing, when they re-enslave Africa, they're going to say, good Father. They're preparing us to accept it. They're preparing the world to accept the re-enslavement of African people all over the world. And I'm saying that Ms. Leskowitz is a pawn in their game, in the tragic irony of it. She is the pawn in the game of people who turn their backs on her people and let them be killed by the millions. American intelligence, French intelligence, British intelligence, the intelligence of the Western world knew exactly what was happening to the Jews in Germany. We raised our voice against this in the old Harlem History Club, 1939 to the death of the leader in 1941. If you think that, if we get into the nonsense about black anti-Semitism, blacks have always had a sentimental attachment to the Jews. They actually believe the Bible. You know, we are the true believers. We out Pope the Pope, we out Muhammad Muhammad. But religion has always been a political thing to Europeans, and still is. And when it no longer serves them politically, they're going to discard it. They turn their back and let this happen. Now they're creating a new game they call Europe has spoiled Europe. They want to take some geography outside of Europe. They say the people they're going to take the geography from are unworthy. They can't rule themselves. Of course, they cannot rule themselves in artificial states set up by the Europeans. First thing Africa has to do is just get rid of these borders. Reestablish the borders along the old lines and integrate Africans into Africa.
Now, that sums it up for this video. What do you guys think? Share
If you want to have a very a diverse population in your society with different racial backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, different heritage, different all of this, the only way that that can really work is if they have something that unifies them, a unified belief system, value system, moral system, and so on. And we have that, alhamdulillah, as Muslims, we have that. And it's comprehensive. In America, they have that, and it's money. It's the unified belief in money, the unified value of materialism and capitalism and consumerism. They call it melting pot. And everything melts away except for money. And money melts everything away about you individually. And that being the case, it's not about character. The population no longer is needed to establish a culture or a character because you've already decided there's not going to be one anyway. There's just money. So you only exist as people in the society to feed the economy. That's the only purpose. Everything, it's economy über alles. There's no means by which the country exists. There's only the ends for which it exists, which is materialism, wealth and prosperity for the few. Yeah. And the way that you can get the masses to be involved in supporting the wealth and prosperity of the few is by having them believe in the promise that someday they're going to be one of those few, even though you never will be. They have that lottery mindset that maybe one day I'll be one of the 1% or the 0.001% and whatever, and you never will be. Which I think you were talking about in the book, where they were talking about all of these different metrics that they use to measure the health of the economy, and none of them measure the health of the economy. What you really need to look at is, are people subsisting? Are they able to, for example, are they able to subsist, a family, are they able to subsist on one income or not? Is their income keeping pace with the cost of living? And is there any real financial upward mobility? Is there upward mobility financially and in terms of their skills, and opportunities and so on? Are any of those things real? Yeah. And upward mobility in America it's a myth. You will die poorer than your parents. That's the reality that everybody is living in. I mean, this generation coming up now doesn't even have the confidence that they will ever be able to buy a home in their lifetime, that they will ever own property in their lifetime. This is, I mean, I think it was the millennials where they said that it would be the first generation in American history that didn't have any realistic expectation of being better off than their parents in their lifetime. That their situation, their condition, their finances, everything would be worse than their parents, and that's the first time in American history. And it's just continuing. They're not the last. They may be the first generation that's like that, but they're not the last. Every succeeding generation will be worse than their parents. Be worse off than their parents. They have this thing. They have this, the passport bros who are fed up from the feminists and the so on and whatever, American women. They want more traditional women and so forth. So this is again a very, very American short-sighted thinking. They think if I get a passport and I go over to the Philippines or Thailand or wherever, and I marry a more traditional woman, I've solved my problem. But the problem is you bring her back. Yep. You bring her right back to America. And but not just that, but within months she's going to be exactly like what you are trying to avoid. You think she's going to stay traditional when she's not in her own society? She's in your society now. And you can't support her. There's a reason why women aren't traditional anymore, because they can't afford to be traditional anymore. Most women aren't in the workplace because of feminism. They're in the workplace for financial survival. I mean, I had a video, an old video from the Qawamun days where I was reacting to Kevin Samuels, and how he used to, mock and condemn women who worked, and say that you wasted your life. You wasted your life on a career, and now you're 40 whatever, and you want a man. You have unrealistic expectations of a man who's making $100,000 a year, 6 or 7 figure income, but you don't bring anything to the table that he wants. because all you did was work, you know, be in the workplace, and you worked and you have nothing to offer him. Okay. But the fact that she wants to marry a man who is making a 6 or 7 figure income means that she wants to be traditional. She wants to be at home. She doesn't want to be working. That's a situation that the economy forced on her. And now you're bringing a girl back from the Philippines back into that same system. What do you think is going to happen? She's going to have to work too. All the same things are going to happen. Why don't you get your passport and just move?
Yeah.
That's how you can solve. That's a much better way to solve your problem. Get out of that system. Get out of that economy. Get out of that country. Get out of that so-called culture. Get out of that so-called civilization and go somewhere that's actually more civilized, that's more advanced, because it's more traditional. You don't have as a man, you don't have a choice.
Yeah.
But to work.
Yeah.
What makes you think she does? What makes you think she has a choice? Let's say that you are enlightened enough and wise enough and disciplined enough and mature enough to reduce your expenses, and you just live very, very simply, which obviously you don't, but let's just pretend that you do. I know, you know, all these red pill types, they like to watch videos about stoicism, but nobody practices it.
Yeah.
None of you are aesthetics. None of you are practicing Zuhud. Let's be honest. But let's pretend that you are. Look at actually what just you as a private single individual, what your expenses are. Assuming you have a car, assuming you have a rent, assuming you have a mobile phone, assuming you have internet, you know, assuming that you have to pay for gas, petrol, whatever, or take public transportation and so on, assuming that you have health insurance, assuming that you have all of the endless bills that you have. Now double it. You know, your grocery bill, double it. With inflation, what it is. Can you, like, okay, if you're single, if you're a single man and you're complaining about women in the workplace, I assume you have substantial savings in your savings account, if you're talking about that, which would make you a rarity from the American workforce. That if you have ample savings in your account, the overwhelming majority of people in the U.S. are living paycheck to paycheck. So if you're living paycheck to paycheck, how are you going to support somebody? What makes you think that she's not going to have to work? And what makes you think that the reason she's working now is because of feminism and not because of financial necessity? Yeah. And that's going to be the case with the girl that you bring over from the Philippines, or from Thailand, or from Malaysia, or from wherever else you go. That's going to be the case with her too. You're not going to be able to support her. That's not your problem. Your problem isn't the female victims of the economic system that you're in. The problem is the economic system that you're in, which is based on a belief system, which is a disbelief system. It's a kufr system. That's why you're in the situation that you're in. And it's not going to resolve it by now going over to a country where someone is in a healthy society, a healthy, normal society, and bringing them into the misery that you live in. You think she's not going to miss back home? This is why your whole so-called civilization is going extinct.
Okay, we are back. That was Mr. Volson. And, of course, we had the legendary John Henry Clark on the great debate there with Mary Lefkowitz and them. And in my opinion, that was one of the biggest, greatest beatdowns of the 20th century. Amazing. But now let's go here and let's look at the damaging stereotype affecting the sisters. We're going to deal with some of that. And keep in mind the chat room is still open. I know right now, I can see right now, we ain't going to be able to cover everything that I got lined up to get this stuff out of here. But let's go with what we know, and let's let it rip.
For centuries, black women have been subjected to a relentless barrage of dehumanizing stereotypes. From movies and TV shows to music videos and theater, portrayals of black women often fall into one of three main categories: the Jezebel, the Sapphire, and the Mammy. These distorted images have shaped public perception, limiting opportunities and inflicting immeasurable harm. Now, according to Bell Hooks, a black feminist scholar in 1992, we should take an oppositional gaze toward these images of black women. This means critically analyzing, challenging, and dismantling these portrayals to ensure they reflect more positive and accurate representations. And that is exactly what we will do in this video. We'll discuss why the Mammy, Jezebel, and Sapphire images were created, why they persist, and how they have evolved.
Oh, you looking for a sassy black friend?
By doing so, we can better understand their impact on black women today and strive to create more genuine and empowering portrayals. Give this video a like to show your support, subscribe for similarly thought-provoking content, and let's begin. Our first character is the Jezebel. The name is derived from a biblical figure named Jezebel, the wife of King Ahab of Israel. She is portrayed as a wicked and manipulative woman who led the kingdom astray through her worship of Baal. Her actions are depicted negatively, and she is often seen as a symbol of evil and sexual immorality. Now, how and why was this stereotype imposed on black women, you might wonder? In 1619, the first ship carrying enslaved Africans docked in Jamestown, Virginia. Upon their arrival, the women were put on the auction block, stripped naked, and inspected to assess their reproductive potential. Once sold, they were subjected to coercion, manipulation, seduction, and most brutally, violent forced sexual relations with slaveholders, their family members, and overseers. Unfortunately, sexual violence did not cease with the end of slavery. During nighttime raids, vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan whipped African Americans, vandalized their property, and brutally abused black women. The Jezebel stereotype, which depicted black women as sexually promiscuous and immoral, was employed to justify these horrific abuses. With both the notion that black women are inherently sex-crazed beings and the view of black people as property, white men have used slavery and its aftermath to foster a culture that aggressively sexualizes black women. In other words, the Jezebel is a stereotype that slanders the sexuality of black women. It gives the impression that black women could not be sexual abuse victims because they always desired sex. Consequently, perpetrators faced few legal or social sanctions for abusing black women. One of the most notorious examples of this exploitation is Sarah Baartman. Enslaved in South Africa, Sarah was brought to Europe in the early 1800s and put on display in London for the voyeuristic pleasure of white Europeans. They ogled her physical features and could even pay extra to examine her genitals. Her nickname, Hottentot Venus, highlights the connection between her body as a black woman and the notions of sexuality and fertility. Hottentot was a derogatory term for the Khoi people of South Africa, while Venus referenced the Roman goddess of love and fertility. Sarah was objectified and dehumanized by a white society that viewed her as less than human. This exploitation mirrored the treatment of black women in the United States, where many enslaved black women faced sexual abuse at the hands of white slave owners. Contemporary Jezebels, often labeled as hoochies, freaks, hood rats, or chicken heads, are commonly seen gyrating in hip-hop music videos. Their barely clothed bodies are frequently draped over luxury cars or groped by male rappers. In some hardcore gangsta rap, these women are subjected to lyrical abuse, mutilation, and murder. Off camera, the life of a video vixen is far from glamorous. The traits associated with the Jezebel stereotype can also be unfairly projected onto black women, regardless of their actual behavior. For instance, when shown sexually provocative videos followed by images of unknown, well-dressed women, white undergraduates were more likely to label the black women in these photos as indecent, promiscuous, sleazy, and sluttish. Researchers Gann, Zillman, and Mitruk in 1997 concluded that the traits and behavior attributed to a small group of black female rappers were unfairly generalized to all black women, while similar generalizations were not made about other groups, such as white women. The Jezebel stereotype can also affect how we view abuse survivors. In a scenario where a man intoxicates and abuses a black woman, college students were less likely to recognize the incident as abuse, think it should be reported to the police, or hold the assailant accountable when the victim was black, according to research by Foley, Ivanek, Karnick, King, and Parks in 1995. According to the researchers, racial history and myths on sexual abuse thus make African American women more vulnerable to forced sexual encounters while simultaneously making accusations of sexual abuse more difficult for them. As a result, black women may face a double dose of cultural myths about sexual abuse, those that apply to all survivors, as well as those that suggest black women are particularly deserving of sexual abuse. In a study by Neville, Hepner, O. Spanierman, and Clark in 2004, black survivors of sexual abuse who internalized beliefs consistent with the Jezebel stereotype, such as the notion that people think black women are sexually loose, reported higher levels of victim blaming. This, in turn, was associated with lower self-esteem. However, acknowledgement of the influence of this image on the mental health of African American survivors may increase their willingness to disclose abuse and seek assistance. So, how do contemporary black women cultivate a healthy sexuality in a society that portrays them as over-sexualized and invulnerable to abuse, an image perpetuated globally through constant music videos? Some artists have developed alternative beauty standards and empowered sexuality to counteract negative stereotypes. Others have sought to reclaim and revise controlling images, such as the Jezebel, by portraying black women's sexuality as positive and pleasurable, as seen in songs like Salt and Pepper's Let's Talk About Sex. The challenge, however, is distinguishing between portrayals of black women as sexually liberated and those as mere sex objects. Are rappers such as Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion victims of the music industry, modern iterations of the Jezebel stereotype, or astute businesswomen who strategically use their sexuality for personal success?
And I guess you think you could cook, clean?
Our second character is the Sapphire, a stereotype that places blame on black women. The Sapphire is depicted as a masculine, angry, and overbearing figure, especially towards her husband. This portrayal has been used to justify the perceived breakdown of black families. Just as the Jezebel stereotype slanders the sexuality of black women, so the Sapphire stereotype slanders their temperament and character. The Sapphire, characterized by her domineering and aggressive behavior towards her husband and others, can be seen as a direct result of the Jezebel stereotype. A woman embodying the Jezebel traits is likely to have children and may not have a supportive partner, which can lead her to adopt the aggressive, Sapphire-like role as a mother. During slavery, the ideal of true womanhood demanded that upper-middle-class white women conform to standards of passivity, frailty, and domesticity. In stark contrast, these standards were not applied to black women. Instead, they were often depicted as strong, masculinized laborers working alongside black men in the fields, or as aggressive figures who drove away their families with their overbearing behavior. In reality, slaveholders frequently sold black women's children and husbands, causing immense grief and understandable anger. Additionally, the absence of their partners forced African American women to take on traditional male roles, such as financial providers. Despite this, social scientists attributed the unemployment and perceived emasculation of black men to black women's dominance and matriarchal status within their families, rather than to discriminatory social policies and economic inequalities. This narrative contributed to the stereotype that black women's roles led to poverty, single parenthood, and the development of criminally inclined, academically underachieving black children. The image of this hostile, nagging black female was derived from the character Sapphire on the 1940s and 1950s radio and television show Amos and Andy.
Georgina, don't you dare talk that way. This is my house and I got my rights in here.
Despite being removed from the airwaves in 1953 due to public outcry, this stereotype persists in modern media, seen in characters like Omarosa on Donald Trump's The Apprentice and other reality shows and recent films. Popularized through hip-hop music and urban fiction, the Sapphire stereotype has evolved into the gangsta girl who is just as violent as her male counterparts. This image is also embodied in Tyler Perry's character Medea, a gun-toting grandmother known for her dramatic gestures, such as rolling her neck and placing her hands on her hips while confronting those who offend her. The Sapphire stereotype frames black women's anger, a legitimate reaction to societal injustice, as either threatening or comical. This portrayal affects how anger is expressed and perceived. While some black women may view this image as empowering, they might also adopt an angry, self-protective demeanor as a defense against discrimination, victimization, and disappointment. Anger can become problematic when it escalates to what Childs and Palmer in 2001 describe as the Sapphire level. This involves taking an argument to extremes, losing perspective, becoming verbally or physically abusive, throwing objects, and using underhanded tactics. When African American women react with intense anger, they may inadvertently alienate their support network and lose emotional backing. Conversely, some may avoid expressing anger to prevent reinforcing the sapphire stereotype, thereby suppressing legitimate feelings. But what can be done to address this situation? Well, first, there is a need to move away from trivializing or humorous portrayals of black women's anger. Instead, more research should focus on the real-life experiences of black women, whose anger is often driven by racism and a lack of power, control, and respect. Assertiveness training can also assist African American women in finding constructive ways to manage their anger, using it as a catalyst for change. For instance, after seeing rapper Nelly use a credit card on the buttocks of a young black woman, students at Spelman College, a historically black women's institution in Atlanta, launched a Take Back the Music protest against offensive song lyrics and videos. These activists organized community forums, wrote articles, and lobbied the music industry to alter these portrayals. Finally, our third character is the mammy. The term mammy, originating in the South after slavery, represents one of the most enduring stereotypes of black women. Typically depicted as dark-skinned and overweight, with large breasts, this image often features her wearing a headscarf to conceal her naturally kinky hair, which was considered ugly by white standards. Tied to her physical characteristics are her personality traits. She is strong, for she certainly has enough girth, but this strength is used in the service to her white master and as a way of keeping her male counterparts in check. She is kind and loyal, for she is a mother. She is sexless. This character is presented as a nurturing mother figure with little depth past being the help. The mammy is mainly depicted as devoted to caring for white children, selflessly loving the family she serves while inevitably neglecting her own. Her selflessness toward those who are not her kin is portrayed as a virtue. Basically, she is a surrogate mother to the white children of the house. However, one must note that a mammy is not quite a mother. In a fantasy context, she may be perceived as a mother, transcending racial boundaries. However, in cultural representation, she remains distinct from an actual mother, with racial distinctions firmly in place. In other words, a mammy can never fully be a mother because her so-called children will ultimately have authority over her due to their white privilege, while she remains black. Although the mammy may discipline and assert authority over the children, even as they grow up, she lacks the comprehensive disciplinary and psychological influence that a true mother holds over her children. Her influence will always be limited by her subordinate status. Despite this, she is content with the system. But the reality is, there is little historic evidence to support the existence of a subordinate, nurturing, self-sacrificing mammy figure. Enslaved women often face severe abuse, including beatings, excessive labor, and sexual exploitation. In response, they would escape, assist others in fleeing, resist punishment, or even poison their oppressors. To cope with this harsh reality, historians and writers altered the narrative to present the image of the loyal, content mammy. The portrayal of mammy in Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, for instance, served to suggest that slavery was a humane institution by implying that mammy was satisfied with her life. Despite attempts to retire the mammy stereotype, it persists in contemporary culture. For example, Aunt Jemima, who has been featured on breakfast products for over a century, exemplifies this image. Even after the Quaker Oats Company updated her appearance in the 1990s by removing her trademark red bandana and eliminating her slave dialect, the mammy stereotype remained prevalent. Similarly, the Pine Sol lady, a dark-skinned, slightly overweight, motherly figure who cheerfully promoted the product with the phrase, "Honey, it's rain-clean Pine Sol," reflects this enduring stereotype. Now, we don't want to imply that caretaking, nurturing, and serving others are inherently negative traits. In fact, these qualities have been vital to the survival and well-being of the African American community. Nor do we mean to suggest that role strain is unique to black women. Women of all ethnicities often face the challenge of balancing the roles of mother, worker, and intimate partner. However, black women on average earn less, have lower educational and job status, and are more likely to be single parents compared to their white counterparts. Consequently, They often juggle multiple roles without economic stability or support from a partner. The mammy stereotype exacerbates this role strain by perpetuating the belief that black women willingly embrace multiple roles rather than being compelled to do so out of necessity. It suggests that they effortlessly manage their responsibilities and have no need to share or delegate tasks. This extreme caretaking, often referred to as mammyism, reinforces these misconceptions. Hip-hop feminist Joan Morgan coined the term strong black woman to encapsulate this image. This spelling suggests that the traits of being strong, black, and female are interwoven into a seemingly unified identity. Both aspects involve a woman's personal sacrifice within her family, community, or workplace, often at the cost of her own mental and physical well-being. While it may be detrimental or emotionally unhealthy to completely forgo vital roles like nurturer, mother, partner, or activist, endlessly working, loving, volunteering, organizing, protecting, and saving others while neglecting one's own needs can also be harmful. So what are the solutions to addressing the role strain experienced by black women? On a societal level, there is a need to tackle the economic and social inequalities that make black women more susceptible to role strain. This involves challenging policies and attitudes that assume black women do not need community or government support, such as social services, child support, and daycare. On an individual level, black women should focus on self-care as much as they care for others, establish clear boundaries, and learn to say no to unreasonable demands. They should also seek and accept social support, allowing themselves to shift from the expectation of being superhuman to embracing their own humanity. This shift can help them express and address the doubts, fears, depression, and frustration that come with their struggles. Now recall that Mammy was depicted as a large, dark-complexioned black woman with a bandana. This portrayal reinforced a beauty standard that favored white or lighter skin, straight, preferably blonde, hair, and thinness. The characterization of black women as unattractive mammies helped to justify and obscure the reality of sexual abuse in plantation households. Despite this, sexual abuse and miscegenation were prevalent in the antebellum South, leading to a variety of skin colors and hair textures among African Americans. Slaveholders used these physical attributes to establish a hierarchy of beauty and social status among the enslaved. Those with more African features were deemed less attractive and intelligent and were thus relegated to field labor. Conversely, individuals with lighter skin and straighter hair, often the children of white slave owners, were sometimes given more education, lighter duties, and better living conditions. These disparities persisted even after emancipation. In the early 1900s, reflecting the broader societal color discrimination, some black communities used European physical features to determine membership in schools, churches, and social organizations. For instance, some exclusive clubs favored African Americans with lighter skin, sometimes measured against a paper bag. Although the Black is Beautiful movement of the 1960s and early 1970s celebrated African physical features, including natural hairstyles and dark skin, colorism, discriminatory practices that prioritize lighter skin over darker skin continues to persist. While many black women feel confident about their complexion and appearance, especially with strong racial identities and family support, some still experience feelings of shame and unattractiveness. These emotional struggles and life limitations often start early, but become more significant in adulthood. Darker-skinned African American women often face lower salaries, less education, and a higher likelihood of marrying less educated partners compared to their lighter-skinned counterparts. Even among educated and financially successful darker-skinned black women, self-esteem is typically lower compared to lighter-skinned peers. Those who resemble the mammy stereotype, often facing economic hardships, are particularly vulnerable to low self-esteem. To enhance their economic and social prospects, some black women use skin lighteners and hair relaxers, but these products can lead to adverse effects like severe acne, skin discoloration, and hair breakage when not used properly. Given the ongoing issues around appearance, it may be time for African American women to start their own Black beauty liberation movement to address the pain, shame, and competition associated with these aspects. Changing our language can be a start. For instance, we should challenge the notion of labeling wavy or straight hair as good and curly or kinky hair as bad. Additionally, The media should better represent the diversity of black beauty by valuing dark skin and kinky hair, which are often associated with the mammy stereotype, just as much as lighter skin and straight hair. By expanding our definition of beauty, African American women can redefine their attributes not by eye color or hair type, but by qualities like pride, intelligence, perseverance, and solidarity. Despite higher rates of obesity, black women often report more positive body images than their white counterparts. Many young black women embrace their curves and take pride in being described as thick, healthy, or fat. Acceptance of larger body sizes in the black community and rejection of restrictive white beauty standards may help some black women maintain body satisfaction. However, this cultural acceptance does not shield all black women from issues like eating disorders. Some develop anorexia, characterized by self-induced weight loss, or bulimia, involving binge eating, followed by purging methods like vomiting or laxative abuse, as noted by O'Neill in 2003. Economic factors can influence the type of eating disorder a black woman may face. For instance, unlike the fictional contented mammy, black women in low-status jobs may experience immense unhappiness, and overeating can become a temporary escape from poverty and emotional deprivation. If obesity is seen as culturally normative for poor black women, healthcare providers might overlook weight gain and potential eating disorders, leading to delayed treatment. Conversely, upwardly mobile black women may feel pressured to conform to the dominant standards of thinness, as a mammy-like appearance might be deemed unattractive and unprofessional. This pressure can lead to excessive dieting as they try to distance themselves from the mammy image. With this, the challenge is to address obesity and its health impacts without fostering negative body images or unhealthy eating habits. This requires culturally sensitive health programs that address the needs of African American women while also recognizing and responding to their unmet emotional needs and the cultural pressures tied to the mammy image. The Jezebel, the Sapphire, the mammy. These stereotypes emerged from historically constructed conditions and were shaped by systemic inequalities like racism and sexism. They persist today and can impact the psychological well-being of many African American women. As black feminist scholar Bell Hooks advocated, adopting an oppositional gaze allows us to recognize, interrogate, and challenge these oppressive images, paving the way for transformation. Although these stereotypes have been widely examined in social sciences, they are sometimes dismissed as outdated, replaced by newer stereotypes like the angry black woman or the welfare queen. However, the older stereotypes still influence contemporary perceptions, albeit less overtly than in the past. Recognizing the ongoing presence of these stereotypes is just the beginning of addressing their harm. There is still a need to advocate for diverse and accurate representations in media and pop culture. This means holding television networks and media producers accountable and choosing to support works that portray black women with nuance and depth. Shows like Insecure and Us provide the rich, multifaceted portrayals that black women deserve. Support media that showcases black women as complex individuals, moving beyond the limiting confines of stereotypes like Jezebel, Sapphire, and Mammy. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for similarly insightful content. Share your thoughts in the comments.
All right, we're back. There you have it. The problem and the solution. The problem and the solution. We're moving right along. Let's deal with some of this hidden information that we didn't ever know about. Watch this one.
The year was 1781. The California sun beat down mercilessly on a dusty trail, where a band of 44 souls, 11 families, walked towards destiny. These brave individuals were the pobladores, a name that whispered townspeople in the Spanish tongue. But their story was anything but ordinary. Traversing more than 1,000 miles across the desert from present-day northern Mexico, they reached a location blessed with a Mediterranean climate, fertile soil, and a river, making it highly suitable for agriculture. Here they founded a farming community, naming it El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora, La Reina de los Ángeles de Porciúncula, which translates to the Town of Our Lady, the Queen of the Angels of Porciúncula in English. Yes, these individuals were the first settlers of Los Angeles. But remarkably, they weren't your typical Spanish settlers. While these pobladores were from the distant provinces of Mexico, historian William M. Mason would later reveal the true racial makeup. Within this group, only 2 were actually classified as white, 16 were mestizos, and a staggering 26 were in fact of African descent. Now you may wonder why there would be a need to emphasize their racial composition. But it is quite an important detail, as back then, racial prejudice was much worse compared to today. Indeed, we can currently classify 56% of Los Angeles founding families as black individuals, but such recognition had not been celebrated publicly for generations. In the 1950s, El Pueblo de Los Angeles State Historic Park honored the city's founders with a plaque. The early settlers of African descent had Spanish surnames, and their ethnicity would not have been known had the plaque not indicated it. But soon enough, the plaque disappeared, with only rumors remaining that several Recreation and Parks commissioners were embarrassed that black people played a part in the city's founding. Another plaque replaced the original one more than 20 years later, but it didn't mention race in honoring the early settlers. It wasn't until Miriam Matthews, California's first credentialed black librarian, advocated for the pobladores, that the city installed another plaque for its bicentennial in 1981. That plaque, a bronze tablet, includes the names of the 44 founders, their race, gender assignment, and age. Of the 11 men representing each of the founding families, Antonio Mesa, Luis Manuel Quintero, Manuel Camero, and Jose Cesario Moreno were of African descent, according to historical research. Without Miriam Matthews, the Dean of Los Angeles Black History, as many rightfully lauded her, these names might have remained lost in the annals of time. But thanks to her dedication, the forgotten melody of the pobladores could once again be heard, which is why we wish to acknowledge her as we present the untold black history within the booming city of Los Angeles. Truly remarkable tales such as these mustn't be forgotten. We must warn you, however, that this is not just a simple story of history, but also a story of a long fight for recognition and respect. Tread carefully, as some of these information can be heavy on the heart. That said, we humbly encourage you to give us a like to show your support, and click subscribe so you'd be able to join us in our other insightful discussions. With this, let's proceed. Known for its glittering sunshine, star-studded industry, and simmering pot of cultures, Los Angeles is a glamorous city that pulsates with life and dreams. But truth be told, it wasn't always this way. It has certainly had many disturbing moments of black prejudice, ironically so. The ones that we will mention in this video might even enrage you. And similar to most thriving areas of civilization, Los Angeles too had a historical tale of war and quest for power and wealth. After the pobladores had fully settled in the new land, the pueblo grew slowly over the next decades as they focused on agriculture and cattle ranching. By 1820, its population had grown to approximately 650 residents, and it was by 1821 that Los Angeles became a part of Mexico, following the Mexican War of Independence. However, this reign came to an abrupt end following the American conquest of California, which was part of the larger Mexican-American War. The last Mexican governor of California, Pío Pico, was of mixed Spanish, Native American, and African ancestry. With this in mind, it's truly unfortunate that many white Southerners who soon came to California during its gold rush era in 1848 brought racist attitudes and ideals with them. This pervasive racism ended up hindering the growth of the black community in Los Angeles, with only a dozen black residents recorded in 1850. And while we can agree that this detail is already quite troublesome, the tales of the California gold rush were also similarly disturbing. This era of loot lust, sparked by the 1848 discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill, ended up triggering a massive influx of approximately 300,000 people from across the globe, a sudden population boom that stimulated the American economy and propelled California towards statehood. It was during this era that Los Angeles had also started to thrive. However, it also had devastating consequences for native Californians, leading to a significant decline in their population due to poor living conditions and systematic violence. Bless their souls. Economy-wise, the California gold rush seemed like a good thing, but its real consequences were quite unsettling, for it attracted many hearts who would do ungodly things for fortune. This would later impact the lives of many more, especially our black brothers and sisters at the time. Fortunately, many still did not stray in faith. as during 1872, the First African Methodist Episcopal Church of Los Angeles was established under the sponsorship of Biddy Mason, an African-American nurse and a California real estate entrepreneur and philanthropist, and her son-in-law Charles Owens. Currently, the church now has a membership of more than 19,000 individuals. In 1880, with the construction of the Santa Fe Railroad and a subsequent surge in settlement, the number of black residents in Los Angeles increased, and by 1900, 2,131 African Americans lived in Los Angeles, making it the second largest black population in California at the time. This population would come to grow massively as the years go by. The promise of a brighter future in Los Angeles attracted a wave of African Americans in the 20th century, joining other diverse groups who flocked to the city after the Southern Pacific Railroad connected it to the rest of the United States. In 1910, the one-story wood-frame 51st Street School became the first all-black school built in Los Angeles. It hired white teachers because discriminatory hiring kept black teachers out of many cities in the state, including Los Angeles. The year after it was built, Bessie Brewington Burke became the school's first black teacher and 8 years later, the school's first black principal. By 1920, the black population in Los Angeles had grown significantly, drawn by the allure of opportunity. However, their dreams of a better life clashed with the harsh reality of escalating racial hostility. Citywide policies systematically eroded black rights, while the Ku Klux Klan and police brutality terrorized their communities, causing immense suffering and disillusionment. Black communities were systematically marginalized by local authorities, resulting in dilapidated infrastructure, substandard transportation, inadequate schools and parks, and restricted access to economic and educational resources. Truly, it is quite disheartening to hear about such oppressions experienced by African Americans in a city whose initial settlers were of African descent. And regrettably, pain has a tendency to stack over time, especially if it is not addressed or resolved. All of this oppression soon transformed into a heavy grudge, with great consequences. Just observe these following developments that we are about to reveal, and in the end, you will see how deep this has truly become. During the Great Depression, Los Angeles experienced a rapid growth in its black population, particularly in what is now referred to as historic South Central. Faced with economic hardships and pervasive racial discrimination in the southern states, many black individuals and families proceeded to seek better opportunities elsewhere. By the 1930s, the approximately 40,000 black residents were primarily concentrated in two neighborhoods, known today as South Park and Watts. Despite the black population reaching nearly 65,000, equivalent to about 4.27% of the total population in 1940, restrictive covenants hindered their ability to move into new areas. Still, the expansion of Los Angeles's black community accelerated during the war years, fueled by significant migration from the American South and Midwest, and drawn by the robust job opportunities in war-related industries. By 1950, the black population in Los Angeles was approaching 200,000, with the South Central to Watts corridor becoming predominantly black. And by 1960, the black population in Los Angeles had grown to nearly 350,000, as black families moved into areas previously dominated by white residents. However, despite the increasing black population, racial tensions in Southern California continued to escalate, as evidenced by the Watts Rebellion of 1965. Now, this story is far from simple. The Watts Rebellion started after a Los Angeles police officer pulled over a young man named Marquette Fry. It began as a traffic stop for suspicion of driving under the influence, but the situation escalated quite too quickly. I remember that they took him and threw him in the car like a bag of laundry and kicked his feet in and slammed the door, an eyewitness told the Los Angeles Times. As it escalated, onlookers grew increasingly apprehensive as the police became more aggressive. This led to the arrest and attack of not only Marquette Fry, but also several members of the Fry family who attempted to intervene and assist him. Witnessing this harshness, a growing crowd of onlookers became increasingly agitated, sparking 6 days of unrest that resulted in 34 deaths, over 1,000 injuries, 4,000 arrests, and $40 million in property damage. The devastating aftermath saw plummeting real estate values and numerous businesses destroyed, leaving a deep scar on the community. Despite the progress achieved during the civil rights era in 1954 to 1968, the legacy of systemic racism and discrimination continued to affect black communities in Los Angeles. As the black population expanded into predominantly white neighborhoods across much of southwestern Los Angeles, New barriers and restrictions were quickly set up. This made segregation worse as the black community continued to grow. By 1970, Los Angeles' black population had reached almost 500,000 people. The ramping up of restrictions to black residency peaked around 1968 when civil rights legislation finally started working to eliminate these barriers. As a result, this era was the low point for integration and the high point of black ghettoization in Los Angeles. Around 1980, Los Angeles' black population reached its high point at just over 500,000. Thanks to civil rights legislation and litigation, black Angelenos were finally allowed to move to all parts of the city where they could afford to buy or rent. Segregation decreased slightly, and very few neighborhoods remained without black families. And as a side note, like we mentioned earlier, it was then in 1981 that Miriam Matthews encouraged widespread acknowledgement of Los Angeles' African roots. By 1990, only a few areas were without black residents in Los Angeles. At this time, Crenshaw District had become the new heart of black Los Angeles. Now with what we just enumerated, did you notice the problem? The reality is, the pervasive systemic racism and discrimination faced by black communities in Los Angeles persisted despite the continuous growth of black individuals populating the city's areas. If you had experienced the exact same thing that they experienced, what would you do? Would you still sit quietly? All of these inevitably led to the Los Angeles uprising, as this is what happens when individuals are made to feel like society mistreats them and undermines their opportunities for a better life. At that point, the city's minority communities harbored a deep-rooted mistrust of the predominantly white police force. These fears were tragically realized in 1991 when a bystander's video captured the brutal beating of Rodney King, an African-American motorist, by Los Angeles police officers. The grainy footage, broadcast across the nation, sparked outrage and protests. A year later, emotions were still raw as the officers stood trial in Simi Valley. The jury's acquittal on almost all charges ignited a powder keg of frustration and anger. Protesters filled the streets, their cries of "No justice, no peace" echoing through the city. The unrest escalated rapidly, morphing into a maelstrom of violence, looting and arson. The epicenter was south-central Los Angeles, but the chaos spread like wildfire, engulfing neighborhoods from the San Fernando Valley to Long Beach. Television screens flickered with horrifying images. Reginald Denny, a white truck driver, attacked at the intersection of Florence and Normandy. Firefighters battling blazes under sniper fire. The city was paralyzed by fear and fury. Mayor Tom Bradley declared a state of emergency, and National Guard troops were deployed to quell the unrest. President George Bush sent in federal troops and declared Los Angeles a disaster area. Rodney King himself pleaded for peace, his poignant question, "Can we get along?" echoing the desperate yearning for reconciliation. But the damage was done. More than 50 lives were lost, thousands injured, and the city lay in ruins. Why can't we get along? Even after so many years of oppression and countless attempts to address the issue, these problems remain, as there are those who do not seek for a change of heart. There are those who refuse to change their perspectives and embrace empathy. Fast forward to the 2000s, these issues are still very much alive. If we look at the bigger picture, despite overall improvements in socio-economic outcomes for black Californians since 2000, significant racial inequality persists, especially compared to white Californians. The latest report by UCLA's Black Policy Project reveals a widening gap in several areas, including home ownership, income, and educational attainment. This disparity is particularly pronounced in major metropolitan areas like Los Angeles, Oakland, Sacramento, San Francisco, and San Jose, largely due to factors like gentrification and rising housing costs. It has gotten so terrible that closing the racial gap between black and white Californians would take over 248 years, as said by Michael Stoll, faculty director of the Black Policy Project, in the 2024 State of Black California report. Since the previous report back in 2000, California's black population has experienced its first decline in decades, shrinking from 2.2 million to 2.1 million, and dropping from 6.6% to 5.6% of the state's total population. It's ridiculous in its truest sense that the decline in black home ownership between 2000 and 2020 in this area was nearly 6%, while other ethnic groups did not experience the same decrease over the same period. Zooming back in to present Los Angeles, the City of Angels shines bright, but shadows still linger over the black community. Finding homes, good jobs, and schools that nurture dreams are still a struggle. and even those sworn to protect can cause fear instead of safety. A 2023 annual country report shows that black residents in Los Angeles were the target of 46% of hate crimes, despite making up only 9% of the population. When will this change? And is it too late for change? Like a flower pushing through concrete, hope persists in the hearts of many black individuals longing for a better life. From the fight for civil rights to the ongoing Black Lives Matter movement, the black community has had a long tradition of overcoming adversity and fighting for change. Let their stories inspire us all to work towards a future where Los Angeles is truly a city of opportunity for everyone. Thank you for watching this video about the brief history of the black community in Los Angeles, including their struggles. If you found this content valuable and want...
What if I told you that there are a group of black Indians that created the largest haven in the U.S. for escaped slaves? I told you that this is a true story of the black Seminoles.
They were the strongest alive. They were ready to die to live. You can never find this taught in school because they were so historically unbelievable. Imagine the pain, escaping slavery, the hunger, the thirst, the long trek to safety called the Trail of Tears. The resolved determination for mutual respect, equality and freedom. And they'd rather die to get there. That's the incredible story of the Black Seminoles. They were warriors of freedom, a cornerstone of a unique culture that historically defied the American predatory foundation for all time. Known as the Black Seminoles or Seminole Freedmen, these were a community derived from runaway slaves who eventually integrated into American Indian culture. The Seminoles were unconquered people, descendants of just 300 Indians who had resiliently and very fiercely refused capture by the US in the 19th century. They were mostly Gullah fugitives who escaped from the rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia, who joined with the newly formed Seminole groups who also had broken away from the Muskogee or Creek people. Both groups were fleeing the decimation of their cultures and people by European-brought violence and disease and sought refuge in the Florida forests. Today, more than 2,000 of them live on 6 reservations in the state, located in Hollywood, Big Cypress, Brighton, Immokalee, Eft, Pierce, and Tampa. Seminole history begins with bands of Creek Indians from Georgia and Alabama who migrated to Florida in the 1700s. Conflicts with Europeans and other tribes had caused them to seek out new lands where they could live in peace. Groups of lower Creeks had moved to Florida to get away from the dominance of upper Creeks. Some Creeks were searching for rich new fields to plant corn, beans and other crops. For a while, Spain even encouraged these migrations to help provide a buffer between Florida and the British colonies. The Seminoles had built their own settlements on the Florida frontier, fought a series of wars to preserve their freedom, and were scattered across North America. They have played a significant role in American history, but never did receive the recognition that was due them. Get ready to dive into a tale of resistance, resilience, and a powerful alliance that rewrites what you thought you knew about American history. Do not forget to like, share, and better still, subscribe to stay with us. This is going to be an interesting ride. Africans have a more than 400-year history in Florida, beginning with the Spanish exploration of the coast and the St. Johns River. The first Africans to reach Seminole County could have been among the early Spanish explorers of the St. Johns River, and certainly were among the escaping plantation slaves of the British colonial years and the later American expansion in the southeast. Some Gullah slaves, which is what they're also called, managed to escape. From coastal South Carolina and Georgia, south into the Florida Peninsula. In the 18th century, Florida was a vast tropical wilderness covered with jungles and malaria-ridden swamps. The Spanish claimed Florida, but they used it only as a buffer between the British colonies and their own settled territories farther south. They wanted to keep Florida as a dangerous wilderness frontier, so they offered a refuge to escaped slaves and renegade Indians from neighboring South Carolina and Georgia. The Gullahs were establishing their own free settlements in the Florida wilderness by at least the late 1700s. They built separate villages of thatched roof houses surrounded by fields of corn and swamp rice, and they maintained friendly relations with the mixed population of refugee Indians. In time, the two groups came to view themselves as parts of the same loosely organized tribe, in which blacks held important positions of leadership. The black Gullahs had adopted Indian clothing, while the Indians acquired a taste for rice and appreciation for Gullah music and folklore. but the Gullahs were physically more suited to the tropical climate and possessed an indispensable knowledge of tropical agriculture. And, without their assistance, the Indians would not have been able to cope effectively with the Florida environment. The two groups led an independent life in the wilderness of northern Florida, rearing several generations of children in freedom, and they recognized the American settlers and slave owners as their common enemy. The Americans called the Florida Indians Seminoles, from the Spanish word Cimarron, meaning wild or untamed, and they called the runaway Gullahs Seminole Negroes, or Indian Negroes. Something very interesting was occurring within the interior of Florida throughout the 1700s and early 1800s. Villages of Creek Indian farmers drifted into uninhabited parts of Florida during this period. They had little contact with the Spanish authorities in St. Augustine. The Spanish didn't dare try to evict the Creeks because of their past unpleasant experiences in combating them. The last time the Spanish tried to invade the Creek Nation in 1703, they left behind around 600 bodies lying on the battlefield. The Creeks did not adopt Spanish traditions or religion. These Creeks in Florida eventually became known as Seminoles because they did not have strong political connections with the Creek provinces to the north. However, even as late as 1776, the Seminoles were merely considered a division of the Creek Confederacy, not a separate tribe. This is how botanist William Bartram described his contacts with the Seminoles in 1776. Simultaneously, Africans had continued to escape from plantations in the southern colonies and sought refuge in Florida. It was much easier for the African slaves to escape farms and plantations along the interior frontier because there were virtually no law enforcement officers in these regions. Of course, the Creeks had a long history of sedentary living and well-planned towns, but the Africans had often been treated as little more than livestock by planters. One of the many delusions held by white planters was that Africans were incapable of surviving without the management of white people. Almost immediately after gaining their freedom, the Africans began establishing orderly, clean villages and planting crops in northern Florida. They developed local governments modeled after those of the Creeks. However, the absorption of Native American culture went far beyond politics. The Africans had switched to wearing Creek clothings. They had also learned to speak the Itsate Creek language instead of either English or African. Itsate was the predominant language of South Carolina and Georgia Creeks. What is even more surprising is that the black Seminoles also adopted the Creeks' ancient monotheistic religion, which was similar to that of the Hebrews before the building of Solomon's Temple, and also the Samaritan sect today. Unlike some other monotheistic religions, Creek and black Seminole women were equal to the men in all ways. In fact, the women owned most of the real estate. However, under the conditions of liberty in Florida, the black Seminoles flourished. U.S. Army Lieutenant George McCall recorded his impressions of a black Seminole community in 1826. This, he had said, "We found these Negroes in possession of large fields of the finest land, producing large crops of corn, beans, melons, pumpkins, and other esculent vegetables. I saw, while riding along the borders of the ponds, fine rice growing, and in the village large corn cribs were filled, while the houses were larger and more comfortable than those of the Indians themselves." The remote regions of Seminole County were sanctuaries for many Africans, the allies of the Seminoles during 3 wars and hostilities during the early to mid-1800s. Along the sparsely populated regions of the St. Johns River, blacks became accomplished woodsmen, hunters, and fishermen. Some became prominent leaders as well as guides and interpreters. They used plantation-learned skills to farm and build shelters. The United States, which acquired Florida in 1821, moved army troops and supplies along the St. Johns and other rivers during its campaigns against the Seminoles and their black allies. Many of these people originally had been captured from African fighting tribes. The Seminoles welcomed them as capable warriors and skilled farmers and allowed them to form their own villages. Many too would be sent to the reservations west of the Mississippi River. From their ranks, the U.S. Army had later on recruited the Buffalo Soldiers of Western law. For the most part, Seminoles and Africans were more like allies against common threats. The U.S. Army, planters, slave hunters, and growing waves of new settlers that led to generational warfare just before slavery split the nation into North versus South. Now let's get down to the basic gist. After the American Revolution, 1776 to 1783, Spain regained control of Florida from Britain as part of the Treaty of Paris. When the British evacuated Florida, Spanish colonists as well as settlers from the newly formed United States came pouring in. Many of these new residents were lured by favorable Spanish terms for acquiring property, called land grants. Even Seminoles were encouraged to set up farms because they provided a buffer between Spanish Florida and the United States. Escaped slaves also entered Florida, trying to reach a place where their US masters had no authority over them. Instead of becoming more Spanish, Florida increasingly became more American. Back when Britain controlled Florida, the British often incited Seminoles against American settlers who were migrating south into Seminole territory. These old conflicts, combined with the safe haven Seminoles provided black slaves, caused the US Army to attack the tribe in the First Seminole War, 1817 to 1818, which took place in Florida and southern Georgia. Forces under General Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish Florida, attacked several key locations, and pushed the Seminoles farther south into Florida. Finally, after several official and unofficial US military expeditions into the territory, Spain formally ceded Florida to the United States in 1821, according to terms of the Adams-Onis Treaty. Damn it! These people were betrayed first by the Spaniards, who never for once cared for the consequences that would befall those whom they've used as buffers for so many years. However, the Seminole settlements in Spanish Florida had kept increasing as more and more runaway slaves and renegade Indians escaped south, and conflict with the Americans had become, sooner or later, inevitable. In 1818, General Andrew Jackson would lead the American army into Florida to claim it for the United States for good. And in doing this, the Seminole War finally erupted. As soon as the United States acquired Florida, it began urging the Indians there to leave their lands and relocate along with other southeastern tribes to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Some Seminole leaders signed a treaty in 1832, and part of the tribe moved. But other Seminoles refused to recognize the treaty and fled into the Florida Everglades. The black Seminoles and Indians fought side by side as military allies throughout the bloody Seminole Wars, in a desperate struggle to stop the American advance. Andrew Jackson had referred to this First Seminole War as an Indian and Negro War. The thing was, the US government had also planned to rid Florida of Seminoles and capture Africans who had fled American plantations and found sanctuary among the Seminoles in the former Spanish colony. The Seminoles too had fled to Spanish Florida after wars and conflicts among rival Creeks of the American Southeast. Andrew Jackson, first as an American general and later as president, pushed a policy of removing all of the tribes to remote land, west of the Mississippi River. The Seminoles resisted the drive to push them into western lands occupied by Creeks, whose slaves were treated much the same as those on American plantations. After the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, the US government attempted to relocate Seminoles to Oklahoma, causing yet another war, the Second Seminole War. The Treaty of Payne's Landing, signed by a small number of Seminoles in May 1832, required Indians to give up their Florida lands within 3 years and move west. When the US Army arrived in 1835 to enforce the treaty, the Indians were ready for war. As Major Francis Dade marched from Fort Brooke toward Fort King, 180 Seminole warriors led by Micanopy, Alligator and Jumper attacked. Only one man of that army detachment survived the ambush. The campaigns of the Second Seminole War were an outstanding demonstration of guerrilla warfare by the Seminoles. The Micos Jumper, Alligator, Micanopy and Osceola, leading less than 3,000 warriors, were pitted against 4 US generals and more than 30,000 troops. The Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, usually referred to as the Seminole War proper, was the fiercest war waged by the US government against American Indians. The United States spent more than $20 million fighting the Seminoles. The war left more than 1,500 soldiers and uncounted American civilians dead. And the obvious duplicity of the US government's tactics marred Indian-white relations throughout the country for future generations. As the hostilities dragged on, frustrated US forces increasingly turned to desperate measures to win the war. For example, Osceola was captured and imprisoned when he met with US troops who had called for a truce and claimed to want to talk peace. With Osceola in prison, the United States was confident the war would end soon, but it did not. Although Osceola died in prison in 1838, other Seminole leaders kept the battle going for a few more years. In 1842, a nominal end to the hostilities arrived, though no peace treaty was ever signed. By this time, most Seminoles had been moved from Florida, relocated to Indian Territory, today's Oklahoma. A third Seminole War broke out in 1855, when conflicts, largely over land, arose between whites and some Seminoles who remained in Florida. Constant military patrols and rewards for the capture of Indians had reduced the Seminole population to roughly about 300 remaining in Florida when the Third Seminole War ended in 1858. These ones hid in the swamps for over a decade. The black Seminoles waged the fiercest resistance, as they feared that capture or surrender meant death or return to slavery. They hadn't only killed, they had killed twice. The American commander, General Jessup, informed the War Department that this, you may be assured, is a Negro and not an Indian war. And a US congressman of the period commented that these black fighters were contending against the whole military power of the United States. The black Seminoles had fled the rice plantations, built their own free settlements in the Florida wilderness, and then fought almost continuously for 50 years to preserve their freedom. It is little wonder they should provide some of the finest soldiers in the US cavalry. While studying the then hidden story of Native American slavery, Florida anthropologist John Worth came to the conclusion that at least 600,000 indigenous people in southeastern North America had been abducted into slavery. Slave raiders typically only took with them young women and teenagers. The men, defending their families, were killed by European slave raiders. The native tribe slave raiders usually tortured and killed all men of military age, plus butchered the toddlers, who could not make the walk back to coastal slave markets. Thus, at least 600,000 Native Americans died as a result of slave raids. The big problem with Native American slaves, though, was that unless they were sold to plantations on Caribbean islands, they often found a way to escape back to Indian tribes within the interior. After King Charles II of England became personally involved in the African slave trade, African slaves became preferred by customers in the British colonies. Almost all of the British colonies, including Georgia after 1752 and Canada after 1763, but excluding Pennsylvania, legalized the slavery of Africans. Thus, the lives of African slaves and Native Americans had become interwoven. Books and newspaper articles were even published, then in the Carolinas, which promoted scientific breeding programs for mixing these two races to create ideal slaves. These documents are absolutely repugnant to modern eyes, because they present non-European humans as being no different than cattle or horses. Human slavery had only been a legally sanctioned institution in the North American colonies for 5 years, when the colony of Charlestown was founded in 1670. By 1710, 20% of South Carolina's population was Native American slaves, and 40% was African slaves. During this period, most African slaves had only a minimal knowledge of English. In their isolation on the coastal rice plantations, they had evolved a new language that is called Gula today. It mixed the words of several African languages with words of the Creek Indians and English. Owners of African slaves, fresh off the ship in New York, Delaware, Maryland and Virginia, had quickly discovered that many of these people died during the harsh North American winters. Over the eons they had evolved bodies, which thrived in the hot, humid tropical climate of West Africa, but were very vulnerable to cold temperatures. Those that happened to mate with indigenous American slaves produced offsprings, whose more muscular, heavy-boned physiques were much more tolerant to wintertime. The African slaves were only able to orient themselves to this strange new land by listening to the words of the Native American slaves. The indigenous and Mustie slaves told of a land to the south called La Florida, where slavery was now illegal. The boldest slaves found ways to escape their bondage. Some Africans accompanied their indigenous friends to native towns in the interior, but with that came the risk of being captured by English bounty hunters at any time. For slaves to obtain secure freedom meant a dangerous walk in bare feet of over 100 miles to the border of La Florida. Along the way were dangerous swamps filled with several species of poisonous snakes and alligators. Most of these freedom seekers were only dressed in rags and carried little or no food with them. As early as 1687, African slaves fled from the South Carolina lowcountry to Spanish Florida seeking freedom. Despite Spain's despicable treatment of America's indigenous peoples in the 1500s, human slavery had now been banned. Under an edict from Philip the Fine of Spain in 1693, the black fugitives received liberty in exchange for converting to Catholicism and defending the Spanish settlers at St. Augustine for at least 4 years. However, most of the black militia was more than happy to be permanently allowed to kill English-speaking invaders. After the province of Georgia was colonized immediately north of La Florida in 1788, the Spanish organized the Africans into a militia led by a man named Francisco Menendez. He was a Mandingo from Africa who had escaped a South Carolina plantation in 1724 and rose to the rank of an officer under the flag of Spain. The African militia unit was based at Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, meaning Royal Thanks of St. Teresa of the town of Moses. It came to be known as Fort Mose. A formally planned settlement was founded around 1738. It was the first legally sanctioned free black town in North America. Contemporary sketches of the fortress suggest that it strongly resembled a fortified Mandingo village, with the addition of Spanish bastions on the corners. In 1740, Fort Mose was attacked by an English army from Georgia, under General James Edward Oglethorpe. The occupants fled to Castillo de San Marcos, but the African militia returned in force to attack the English troops there, killing all but about 30 of them. The fort and settlement was rebuilt in 1752, but abandoned in 1763, when Spain and France lost the 7 Years' War, and Great Britain had gained ownership of Florida. However, in the long run down the 1800s, when the army captured the black Seminoles at some point, the US government had refused to return them to slavery, fearing that these seasoned warriors, accustomed to their freedom, would turn the Seminole War into a widespread slave rebellion. That alliance ended in 1838 when the United States offered to recognize the freedom of the black Seminoles and pay them money if they would lay down their arms and agree to move to the Indian Territory. Over 500 black Seminoles took up the offer. Once in the West, many black Seminoles adapted to the lifestyle of the plains. Most were already expert horsemen. Some became cowboys. Many black Seminoles accepted an offer from Mexico to form a border patrol to combat Comanche and Apache raiders. In 1850, a group of black Seminoles and Seminole Indians escaped south across Texas to the desert badlands of northern Mexico. They established a free settlement and, as in Florida, began to attract runaway slaves from across the border. In 1855, a heavily armed band of Texas Rangers rode into Mexico to destroy the Seminole settlement, but the blacks and Indians stopped them and forced them back into the US. The Indians soon returned to Oklahoma, but the black Seminoles remained in Mexico, fighting constantly to protect their settlement from the marauding Comanche and Apache Indians. In 1870, after emancipation of the slaves in the United States, the US cavalry in southern Texas invited some of the black Seminoles to return and join the army. Wildcat and John Horse, leaders among separate groups of Seminoles and black Seminoles who were forced to accept reservation land in the Oklahoma Territory, moved to Texas, then across the Rio Grande to live in the mountains of Nacimiento in the Mexican state of Coahuila. The Mexican government, which banned slavery in the years before war between the Union and the Confederacy, allowed the Seminoles and black Seminoles to stay and raise cattle and plant crops in return for providing warriors to patrol the Mexican border with Texas and create a line of defense from raids into Mexico from other tribes. These black Seminoles would be called Mascogos, a name that comes from Muskogee, the language shared by many of the tribes of the Southeast. Mexican Civil War led to the black Seminoles migrating back across the Rio Grande when slavery ended after the Civil War. The moves were encouraged by the US government, which wanted the Seminoles and the black Seminoles to prevent raids into Texas. This was at the end of the Civil War. The black Seminoles had been invited to return to the United States to serve in a special ops unit to combat hostile tribes and enforce martial law in the South during Reconstruction. Those that accepted were promised land and retirement pensions at the end of their service. This had motivated them greatly. They had believed the United States on their word and had taken up the deal, trusting as they can be, for good and survival. The US Army recruited black Seminoles as scouts. This forerunner of the Green Berets or Navy SEALs quickly developed the reputation as the finest military unit in the West. It was soon expanded into being the Seminole Negro Scout Troop of the new 10th Cavalry Regiment. In 1875, 3 of the scouts won the Congressional Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, in a single engagement with the Comanche Indians on the Pecos River. However, when it came time for them to retire, Although the Black Seminoles became known as the best scouts in the best cavalry regiment in the West and won 4 medals of honor, not one of them ever did receive land or a pension thereafter. The US government officials said that it had lost the original treaty and had no record of them serving in the US Army. Like seriously? Even heirs of the Black Seminoles who became the famed Buffalo Soldiers of the Western frontier had to insist that the Army said they would be given their land in return for their military service. But no such documents ever did surface. In 1873, command of the Scouts was given to Lieutenant John Bullis, writes Katarina Vitic in a 2002 research paper. The Mascogos, Native Americans, African Americans, Mexicans. She continues, under Lieutenant Bullis, the Scouts would spend the next 10 years as a major force in the eradication of Indian and bandit depredations in that area of Texas. Every commander who worked with the Scouts praised them for their courage and their skills, and those who worked most closely with them were the most vehement in their protests at the abandonment and mistreatment of the Mascogos by the US government. The Scouts would win 4 medals of honor, an incredible statistic for their tiny numbers. They served valiantly in a number of capacities until they were disbanded in 1914, but the US government kept none of its promises to them. She adds, at the height of the Indian Wars, when the Scouts were continuously in the field providing invaluable service to the US Army and the citizens of Texas, their families and community were starving because the government had cut off their rations and would give them no land or supplies for farming. Instead, some Black Seminoles stole cattle to feed their families. Texas cattle ranchers sent hired gunmen to threaten or kill Black Seminoles. When John Horse was shot and captured, Wildcat paid his ransom. With little hope of changes, many Black Seminoles crossed the Rio Grande again to live in Mexico. The US Army had disbanded the remaining Black Scouts empty-handed in 1914. Even Medal of Honor winners? There was neither land nor pensions for any of these loyal-minded Black Seminoles. This would mean that they were being tricked all along by the US into their bidding, their crafts, skills and strength exploited yet again, only to be left high and dry in the end. Yet another humiliating betrayal of the blacks this was, by the United States. In 1842, the Army forcibly removed them, along with their Indian comrades, to Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, in the unsettled West. The Black Seminoles, exiled from their Florida strongholds, were forced to continue their struggle for freedom on the western frontier. In Oklahoma, the government put them under the authority of the Creek Indians, slave owners who tried to curb their freedom, and white slave traders came at night to kidnap their women and children. However, after all said and done, today, there are still small Black Seminole communities scattered by war across North America and the West Indies. The Black Indians live on Andros Island in the Bahamas, where their ancestors escaped from Florida after the First Seminole War. The Seminole Freedmen, the largest group, live in rural Seminole County, Oklahoma, where they are still official members of the Seminole Indian Nation. The Mascogos dwell in the dusty desert town of Nacimiento in the state of Coahuila in northern Mexico. And finally, the Scouts live in Bracketville, Texas, outside the walls of the old fort, where their grandfathers served in the US cavalry. These groups have lost almost all contact with one another, but they have all retained the memory of their ancestors' gallant fight for freedom in the Florida wilderness. In 1978, Dr. Ian Hancock discovered that elders among the Texas Scouts still speak a dialect of Gullah, 140 years after their ancestors were exiled from Florida, and as much as 200 years after their early ancestors escaped from rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia. Both the Oklahoma and Texas groups, though deeply conscious of their Florida heritage, were unaware of their connection with the Gullah in South Carolina and Georgia. They did not know precisely where their slave ancestors had come from before fleeing into the Florida wilderness. The Oklahoma Seminole freedmen still possess a rich traditional culture combining both African and American Indian elements. They continue to eat rice as a characteristic part of their diet, sometimes applying a sauce of okra or spinach leaves, like the Gullah, and like their distant relatives in West Africa. In closing, it is said that in the year 1970, the Indian Claims Commission had awarded the Seminoles, of both Oklahoma and Florida, collectively, $12,347,500 for the land taken from them by the US military. This brings us to the end of yet another video. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.
Yeah, I saw someone in the comment section the other day saying that telling me that I shouldn't say the West, I should say Western imperialism to differentiate it from, oppressive Western policies. Okay, I don't know if you've ever known me to be imprecise in my choice of words. I say the West because that's what I mean. I also saw someone saying on the same video that I'm just bitter. How astute of you. Of course I'm bitter. I'm a Westerner. That means that I was taught a fictitious story my whole childhood about the West. And I didn't actually get any sort of decent education until I was an adult. And it wasn't provided to me. I had to search it out. I had to find it out. It was hidden from me. And what I found out was that I actually come from a civilization that never civilized. I came from a so-called civilization that is identical to abject primitivity. I came from a so-called civilization that's what you would expect from people who were raised by wolves. It's like your culture was dropped on its head as a baby. The brain of this so-called civilization has a deformed amygdala. The prefrontal cortex of the Western mind is missing. It's like a psychopath. So yes, I learned that I came from a so-called civilization, a so-called culture, that completely failed to develop. We're like the moronic bully in school who pushes people around as a kid, never pays attention, never learns, never studies, and never changes. So that everyone that he bullied, eventually surpasses him in adulthood, in every conceivable way, in maturity, in skills, in knowledge, in intelligence, in career, in health, in relationships, in everything. While he remains a stunted man-child who nobody can stand. No one wants to be around. Well, that's the West. Every Westerner has been deprived by their ancestors of a history that they can be proud of. A history that gives them a chronological record of their development, their advancement as a people. Because the West is just as primitive, just as barbaric, just as shallow, just as selfish, petty, deceitful, and immature as they were 3,000 years ago. So I say West because I mean the West. You can't divorce imperialism from the so-called civilization that imperialism emerged from. This isn't even just about the endless crimes of the West against the rest of the world. No, I'm talking about the whole so-called culture, the so-called civilization that has utterly and miserably failed its own people. You literally had to suppress everyone else, oppress everyone else, burn, loot, and destroy everything that everyone else had, everything that they built, that everyone else built, everything that they accomplished, just so you could try to make your so-called civilization look developed, only by de-developing everyone else. You had to tie their hands and feet just to pretend that you could beat them in a race. And again, it's just like some dumb bully in school who cheats on his test, cheats on his homework. Okay, you'll get an A on the test, but you're still dumb. And you won't progress educationally at all. That's not going to benefit you. Your appearance of knowledge on a test you cheated on is short-lived. Whereas you can lock the smart kid in the gym locker, but he's still the smart kid. I mean, imagine, you go all around the world and smash up everything that other civilizations built, loot what they built, pillage, steal, even steal their ideas and their concepts and their philosophies. And then you sit on top of this mountain of stolen goods and declare yourself to be rich because of your own merit. And imagine telling this lie to your children, to your own children, to your grandchildren, generation after generation. How do you think that's going to go? You didn't invest in creating actual merit. You cheated, you lied, you stole, you brutalized. And then you tell your own people that everyone else in the world has nothing and you have everything because of how much better you are than everyone else. How long is that lie sustainable? I mean, these are people who actually have civilizations, who actually created and built and accomplished and didn't just pillage and plunder. And there's still those people today, even though you have oppressed them, there's still those same people. And you're still the way you are. Wallahi, the West let its people down. The West let their own people down. I mean, a good example actually is African Americans. I don't know if you can think of a people who were more held back, more deprived, more sabotaged than African Americans. You took everything away from them and took them away from everything. They started in your country at less than zero, literally regarded and treated as subhuman, not allowed to learn to read or write or anything. for hundreds of years. But you see, they come from a people of accomplishment to one degree or another. Not a people of piracy and theft and appropriation. They come from a people who created and built and developed in their own countries, in their own land. And even though you did everything that you could possibly do to suppress them, to hold them down, to hold them back, and you're still doing that until today, nevertheless, I don't think anyone can dispute the fact that African Americans have become a global cultural superpower. Culturally, they're a superpower. Whatever cultural soft power that America has in the global south, it's African American. And China, one of the most ancient civilizations on earth, over 4,000 years as an organized civilization. You tried to destroy them, tried to poison that society with opium. America has tried for decades to destabilize and undermine and sabotage China. And they're totally surpassing. Today, they're surpassing you in everything. Their technology is better than yours. Their relations with the rest of the world are better than yours. Their economy is healthier than yours. Their schools are better than yours. Because they are a people with a history of actual homegrown accomplishment and development. And people like this, with a history like this, with a legacy like this, simply cannot be held back for any length of time by a people who do not have a similar history, people who have never actually invested in their own civilizational development. And that's the West. You're going to get left behind. You're going to get surpassed, and you are going to end up being nothing more than a footnote in history. Because the peoples of the world who have genuinely developed civilizations cannot be kept down indefinitely. No one, for example, bounced back from Western imperialism and colonization faster than the Muslims. Because our foundations are too strong. Our history is too strong. Our achievements are too many. Our culture is too rich. Our beliefs are too powerful. You could only inflict superficial damage on us. The whole history of Western colonialism in the Muslim world only amounts to a flesh wound. Our empire was never based on being a political entity. Political governance was a byproduct of belief. Our empire was an empire of faith. And that empire remains completely intact today. And it will always be intact. But everything that you call Western civilizational achievement is stolen. From your architecture to your philosophy. You are appropriators, cheaters. Even your Greco-Roman so-called philosophers, who themselves took from the Egyptians, even these foundational thinkers of what you like to call Western philosophy, if it had been left to you, they would have all been left in the dustbin of history, if it weren't for the Muslims. We taught you what they said, and when you learned it according to Muslim interpretation and correction. Their ideas passed through us before they ever reached you. So even your so-called enlightenment, your discovery that reason and rationality are things that exist, well, you didn't discover that. We taught you that. And we were able to teach you that even before any Muslim ever read Plato or Aristotle, because the Muslims are people who have always deeply invested in their own intellectual development. So the Enlightenment, Europe's big eureka moment, was just copied and pasted. You're fakers. The only way that you can ever have an idea is to take it from someone who has ideas. And you've been historically incredibly stubborn about not developing, not maturing, not civilizing. It's really remarkable. I mean, look, even Christianity, when they tried to spread Christianity, even this corrupted version of the teachings of Nabi Isa alayhi salam, the Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, when they tried to spread this in Europe, they cravenly adapted it to incorporate already existing pagan ideas, polytheistic beliefs, festivals, practices, and so on, until it bore no resemblance whatsoever, not only to the, didn't bear any resemblance not only to the original teachings of the Prophet Jesus alayhi salam, but not even to the version of Christianity that's followed in the Middle East. Your Christianity was just a repackaging of paganism. Because again, you are dead set against developing. You're dead set against developing intellectually, spiritually, morally, and in every other kind of way. I'm telling you, your ancestors have betrayed you. They betrayed you because they never bothered to invest in your future. They never bothered to actually create and develop as a people. And they only took and stole and pillaged and pretended. So they did not bequeath to you any sort of civilization that contributed genuinely to mankind. It's a so-called civilization only obsessed with destruction, with destructive power, with annihilation, with violence and death. It literally resents development. It resents advancement and creation and building and achievement. It's incredibly negative and dysfunctional. It's incredibly harmful. You literally measure power by its ability to destroy, not to create. By the ability to oppress, not to uplift. And look, before you misconstrue what I'm saying, this has nothing to do with skin color. It has nothing to do with your so-called race. None of this is innate in anyone's DNA. That's an obscene notion. Thinking that way is in and of itself symptomatic of colonized thinking, of westernized thinking. You know, this attribution of character traits to physical traits. The attribution of virtue or lack of virtue to genetics. Attributing spiritual qualities to superficial qualities. No, this has nothing to do with that. This is about culture. It's about the legacy of a culture that never matured. A legacy left to the descendants of people who thought predation and pillage was better than creation and innovation and knowledge. A legacy of underachievement as a so-called civilization that thought the ability to take from others was the same thing as merit. A culture that does not understand the importance of the means, but only values the ends, and thinks that if they can acquire the desired ends by vicious means, then they're the same as a culture that can achieve those same ends by honorable means. Like I said, it's just like a cheater. You know, it doesn't matter how I win the race as long as I win. That's the Western attitude. So even if I win by chopping off the legs of the other participants, I can still consider myself to be the best and fastest runner. You see? Even if I'm not genuinely an athlete, even if I'm not actually even fast, even if I never trained and I have no discipline and I have no ability, I get to call myself an Olympic champion as long as I can get that gold medal, even if the way that I get that gold medal is by shooting the actual winner of the medal and stealing it off his chest. Everyone has to praise me as a great athlete now because I have the medal. This is literally the Western mentality. That's a failed culture. It's a culture that has failed its own people. But yes, this is not innate. It's not inherent. It's not about white people. I mean, just terms like this, white people, black people, and so on, as if any people are actually literally white or literally black. You came up with these terms just to try to impose the idea that these are opposites, even though all people are actually just shades of varying degrees. You wanted to trap people by these fabricated definitions, these oppositional definitions, but it's all stupid. Again, this is your biggest contribution to humanity that really came from you, imposing a color code on the human race. No, I'm telling you this so that you can recognize that your ancestors failed you. Your culture has failed you. Your so-called civilization has betrayed you. And you should try to come to terms with that fact so that you can potentially free yourselves from it. Because as I've said many, many times, your own so-called civilization mistreated you before it ever became powerful enough to mistreat people outside the West. They brutalized you and they brutalized your ancestors long before they ever reached out beyond their borders and started brutalizing everyone else. And even when they did reach beyond their borders to brutalize everyone else, they didn't stop doing wrong to you. And the worst wrong thing that they've done to you is to make you think that you're supposed to be proud of this history, proud of this culture, proud of this so-called civilization that has left you completely unprepared for living harmoniously with the rest of the world, living harmoniously with all of your brothers and sisters on this planet. This so-called civilization that did not cultivate in you morality or manners or sincerity or virtue or honesty or maturity or mental and emotional stability, not to mention spiritual peace and stability. It's a cutthroat culture. It's a barbaric culture. And it has left you completely at a loss as a people. And yes, it has made you despised, it has made you blamed, and it has made you resented because of your history and because you keep repeating that history with every new generation. See, when I say things like this, Westerners get defensive, and that defensiveness is symptomatic of exactly what I'm talking about. They'll say, let's not dwell on the past. Okay, let's not. Let's look at right now, today. And you try to show me how today is any different from the past. And this is why you get defensive. Because you know that when I talk about the crimes of the past, you can't with any honesty disavow the crimes of the past because those crimes are ongoing. And those crimes are protected precisely by your defensiveness. Well, this is a catastrophic trap that you're in. And you have to get out of it before you sink into oblivion. And no one can help you get out of it. No one is obliged to try to help you get out of it. You have to do it yourself. Which again is not something that your whole culture or your so-called civilization has ever prepared or equipped you to do. That's what I mean about how a cheater ultimately only cheats himself. You know, when you're a plantation owner and you lose your slaves, well, you lose your crops as well, and you have nothing, because you never learned how to grow anything yourselves. You're not farmers. You're like the king in Hamlet, who knows that he can never sincerely repent for his crime because he retains the crown for which he did the crime. And you don't want to relinquish your ill-gotten gains. You don't want to give up that stolen crown. So you get defensive instead of repentant. And there's no solutions for you in your own history. No return to traditional values or what have you. No, that's not going to help you. I mean, trying to go back and emulate the very ancestors who failed to build a genuine civilization and who set you on the very path to oblivion that you're on now, that's not a remedy. So-called Western civilization is a myth, and you're not going to find any solutions as long as you hold on to any belief in that fiction. Your history does not contain any guidance for you, except insofar as it shows you very clearly how not to be. You need to stop digging in those empty pockets. I mean, if you dig into the pockets of Western history, all you're going to do is get your hands stained with blood. Like I've talked about before, your history, your origin, in the wilderness of Europe, it was harsh. You were in a harsh environment, cold and formidable. And you took the attitude, your ancestors I'm talking about, took the attitude that violence and dominance were the only means for survival. And this attitude pervades all aspects of your culture, from colonization to marriage, from international relations to relations between the sexes. You can go as deep as you want analyzing that society, Western society, and you can see how this primitive attitude manifests on every level of that society and that culture. And then there's all the lies that you have to tell each other and tell yourselves. Because the West eventually did encounter genuine civilizations, and so they wanted to pretend that they too were civilized, so they espouse all these values and principles and so on that they never adhere to and don't really even understand. And this is where so much of the cognitive dissonance comes from, because yes, you do have an untarnished human nature, what in Islam we call the fitra, the intrinsic good human nature that's buried inside you. And that conflicts with your society, it conflicts with your history, it conflicts with your actions, and it conflicts with your ideologies. And you have two ways to try to deal with that conflict. Either you actually resolve the conflict, or you just plaster it over with propaganda and indoctrination and lies. But your culture is a tumor, and it will devour the West in its entirety, just as it devours the conscience of every individual Westerner, unless they undergo some kind of psychological, civilizational radiation therapy. Just as a body rejects and struggles against a tumor, your own conscience rejects and struggles against your history, your culture, and your so-called civilization. I mean, you're really in the same struggle as the rest of us, in a way, because the West has been a parasitic tumor on the whole of humanity for centuries. And we've been resisting it. And you should too. Because it isn't any healthier for you than it is for us, truth be told. And that's the only reason why I'm telling you this. But you get defensive. And you want to pretend that that tumor is actually a vital organ. Well, it isn't. You can, just like anybody else, you can actually change. You can actually become what you claim to already be. But that can only happen once you recognize and acknowledge that you aren't now what you claim to be. And then you can start learning, inshallah, from the people who really are the thing that you claim to be, which is civilized.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it. I hope we got something out of this. Still got a ton of this stuff to go, so we coming back with another broadcast. But in the meantime, y'all have a good evening and a good night. Bye-bye.
The right talent.
The right attitude.
The right game plan.
The right amount of fight, pride, and determination.
When everything comes together, you just feel it.
And you'll let nothing get in the way of your goal.
You're ready to step up, meet the moment, and play to win. If you've been injured, put our force to work for you.
Farrah and Farrah, here for Jacksonville, here for good.
With the Lucky Land Slots, you can get lucky just about anywhere.
This is your captain speaking. We've got clear runway and the weather's fine, but we're just going to circle up here a while and get lucky. No, nothing like that. It's just these cash prizes add up quick. So I suggest you sit back, keep your tray table upright, and start getting lucky.
Play for free at LuckyLandSlots.com. Are you feeling lucky? No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply.